was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a break from everything, work, city noise, my crowded apartment. I'd rented a small, secluded cabin up in the mountains, a place with no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just me in the woods. The kind of isolation that was supposed to feel peaceful but, as it turned out, only served to deepen my restlessness. I arrived late on Friday night, long after sunset, and the drive had been more exhausting than I'd expected. The road that led to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path, winding through thick trees that seemed to crowd in on me as I went. The cabin itself was small, just one floor, a little porch, and an old wood-burning stove inside. It smelled of pine and mildew, but I didn't mind. The air was fresh, the night quiet. Too quiet. I spent the evening unpacking and getting a fire started. The wind outside was picking up, a light drizzle beginning to fall. By the time I was settled on the couch with a glass of wine, the rain was coming down in sheets. The kind of downpour that made the world feel distant, muffled. I remember the first thing that felt off was the knocking. At first I thought it was the wind, a branch or something brushing against the wood. But then it came again, louder this time. A quick, sharp knock, followed by another, then another. 3 distinct raps at the door. My heart jumped in my chest. I didn't want to open it. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in this storm? I peered through the cabin's small, dusty window, but saw nothing but a wall of rain. Just as I was about to let out a breath of relief, the knocking came again, more urgent now. I stood frozen, staring at the door, not knowing what to do. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe it was the creeping suspicion that someone had been watching me from just beyond the edge of the woods. Maybe I was too isolated, too vulnerable to ignore it. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. A figure stood in the rain. A man, or at least I think it was a man. He was tall, thin, his clothes soaked through, his face hidden under the brim of a wide, dark hat. His posture was unnaturally straight, like he was too stiff to be real. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, my stomach twisting in a way I couldn't explain. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice sounding too small in the heavy silence. He didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to look into his eyes, but his face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. "I'm sorry, I don't have anything for you," I said, my hand instinctively reaching to close the door. The man took a slow step forward, his boots squelching in the wet mud. My breath caught in my throat. There was something wrong about the way he moved, too slow, like he wasn't in a hurry, like he was waiting. "Please," I said, my voice cracking, "I don't have anything for you. Go away." Still, he didn't speak, and his gaze never left mine. I was frozen, my fingers pressing into the door frame. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the man stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I slammed the door shut, heart hammering in my chest. The wind howled outside, and for a moment I just stood there, listening to the rain and the storm, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and retreated into the living room. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I kept glancing toward the door, waiting for something to happen, some kind of movement in the woods. But there was nothing, just the dark, wet silence. Hours passed, the storm raged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it had been nothing more than a strange encounter. Still, I couldn't sleep. It was just before dawn when I heard the noise again. This time it was softer, like scratching, slow and methodical, coming from the window. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature trying to get inside. But then the scratching stopped and I heard something else, breathing. Deep, heavy, like something, or someone, was waiting right outside the window. I dared not move. My heart felt like it might explode from my chest. I was too afraid to look, but I knew there was something out there. I grabbed my phone, intending to call for help, but it had no signal. The battery was dead too. I threw it aside, cursing under my breath. The breathing grew louder, and then, as if to confirm my worst fear, the sound of footsteps began, moving slowly across the porch, one step at a time, just out of sight. Suddenly there was a sharp knock at the door. But it wasn't just any knock. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone or something was trying to make a point. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to leave. I grabbed my coat, shoved my feet into my boots, and rushed to the back of the cabin. The rain was still coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees. I pushed through the back door, stumbling into the mud, desperate to get away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. Through the rain, through the trees, the branches whipping at my face. I don't even remember how long I ran or where I was going. I just needed to get out. Finally, I reached the main road, and I didn't stop running until I saw headlights in the distance. A car? Thank God, a car. I waved it down, my voice hoarse from the cold and fear, and the driver, an older man with a kind face, stopped to help. "Are you okay?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat, shivering. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what happened." The man didn't press. He just drove, slowly, his headlights cutting through the storm as we made our way back toward civilization. When I finally reached my apartment, safe and sound, I told myself I'd never go back there. I would never return to that cabin. But the feeling, that feeling, still lingers. The night I left, I thought I heard something. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. Not from the woods, but from the storm. Something I couldn't quite place, something that was still out there, waiting. I'd been on the road for hours, driving through endless stretches of empty highway, the world outside dark and quiet. I was heading home from a business trip, having missed the last flight and not wanting to wait until morning for the next one. So I opted for the bus, one of those late-night routes that barely anyone takes. I didn't think much of it at first. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few people scattered throughout. The kind of ride where everyone keeps to themselves, just staring out the windows or half dozing off. There was an unsettling silence, the kind that presses against your ears. Only the sound of the tires humming on the road filled the air. Somewhere around midnight, the bus stopped. We were in the middle of nowhere, a patch of highway where even the street lights had vanished into the distance. The driver, an older man with a thick accent and a tired face, opened the doors, and I thought he might be taking a rest stop. Maybe to stretch his legs, grab a coffee. But no one got off, and no one got on. The doors closed, and the bus continued down the road, but I noticed something strange. A feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the bus. All the passengers were still there, but something was wrong. They were too still. Their faces blank. Their eyes wide open, but not blinking. It was as if they were frozen in time. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the road ahead, but the unease grew. The bus continued to move, and I watched as the road outside blurred by, the same scenery of endless trees, small towns, and overgrown fields. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, the figure appeared. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something moving in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, a man had appeared at the front of the bus. Tall, disheveled, his face obscured by a large hood. He wasn't there before. He couldn't have been. He wasn't sitting, though. No, he was just standing at the front, staring at me. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, cold and unblinking. My heart raced. I wanted to call out, ask the driver if he knew who this was, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed, like some unseen force was pressing me into my seat. The man never moved, not even a muscle. The bus passed another sign, and I realized we were still far from any major city. In fact, we seemed to be heading deeper into nowhere. I tried to ignore the figure, looking away, staring at the seat in front of me. But then, something even stranger happened. The other passengers began to move. They didn't shift or adjust their postures like normal people would. They jerked as if they were being controlled by some outside force. Their heads turned toward me all at once, their eyes wide but not blinking. Not a single one of them made a sound. My breathing quickened, my chest tightening. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I wasn't imagining it. They were all looking at me, each of them with that blank, unblinking stare, as if I was the only thing keeping them tethered to reality. I had to get off. I had to escape. My hand shot to the bell and I pressed it desperately. The sound echoed through the bus, but the driver didn't seem to acknowledge it. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his face like stone. The man at the front shifted slightly. He was closer now. I hadn't seen him move, but he was right there, staring down at me with that hood still casting most of his face in shadow. Suddenly, the bus screeched to a halt and the lights flickered. The man stepped toward me, his footfall silent on the bus floor. I could feel his presence growing closer, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I stood up, my body shaking, and rushed toward the door. The bell rang again, and this time the driver turned to look at me, his eyes blank, devoid of emotion. "You must stay," he said, his voice cold, almost mechanical. "We're almost there." Before I could respond, the door swung open. I didn't wait for an invitation. I bolted out into the night, the rain hitting me like ice needles. I didn't look back. I ran until I found a gas station, its neon lights flickering in the distance. Panting, I stumbled up to the counter and tried to explain what had happened. The man behind the counter didn't seem surprised. "You were on the last bus," he said, his voice low, almost pitying. "Don't worry. It'll never come again." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "I'm alive. I made it." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "It takes people. Those who don't make it off, they don't come back. You were lucky." The words echoed in my mind as I walked away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I ran, I wasn't free. Somewhere out there, the bus was still waiting. That night, I found myself alone in my grandmother's old house. She had passed away years ago, and the house, which sat on the outskirts of a small village, had been left empty ever since. I never thought much about the place while she was alive, except for one thing, the old mirror hanging in the living room. My grandmother always told me that there was something strange about that mirror, something I'd never fully understand. I was a child back then, and I didn't take her warnings seriously. But after her death, I realized I'd never really paid attention to it. The mirror had a gold-framed border, intricately carved with ancient symbols, and the glass had become cloudy and yellowed with time. That night, I sat on the couch in the living room, the flickering light of a candle casting long shadows across the room. I tried to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting back to the mirror. There was something unsettling about it, something that drew me in. Every time I glanced at it, the reflection seemed off, like something was waiting there just beyond the surface. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I would look away, and when I glanced back, I would see a shadowy figure standing in the reflection. But when I turned around, the room was always empty. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the light, but as the hours passed, the reflection grew clearer. A woman, pale skin, dark hair, wearing a white dress. I could almost make out her face, though it seemed distorted, her eyes wide and fixed on me. I stared at her, frozen. She didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for something. And then, in the blink of an eye, she lifted her hand and pointed directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I looked at the mirror again, but there was nothing. The reflection was empty, just my own confused face staring back at me. I must have been imagining it, but the unease didn't fade. It grew. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the reflection. Every now and then I would catch a glimpse of her again, just standing there, staring at me, her fingers still pointing. And then it happened. The woman moved. She didn't walk. She just shifted as if she was suddenly standing closer to me. Her eyes, those cold, dark eyes, stared straight into mine. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear any words. Just a faint whisper like a breeze. I turned around quickly, my heart racing. Nothing. The room was as empty as it had been before. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I ran to the door, but before I could open it, I heard a soft click, like the sound of something being unlocked. I froze. I turned back to the mirror and my blood ran cold. There, in the reflection, was me. But it wasn't me, not really. My reflection was still, too still, and my eyes, they were wide open, unblinking. There was no emotion in them, just emptiness. And then, in the reflection, I saw it. I wasn't standing there alone. The woman, she was behind me now. Her fingers were pressed against the glass, and her face was twisted in a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't be here," a voice, low and distant, echoed from the mirror. My body froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring into the reflection as the woman's lips curled into a sinister grin. The lights in the room flickered and went out. The darkness felt suffocating, thick and heavy. I could hear her breathing now, soft and slow, like something close. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. A loud bang made me jump. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The room remained silent, still. I had to leave. I had to get out. I ran to the door, yanked it open, and stumbled into the cold night air. The wind howled through the trees, but the sense of dread didn't leave me. My mind was racing, my chest tight with fear. I didn't look back, not once. I just ran, away from the house, away from the mirror, away from whatever was in there with me. But as I reached the end of the yard and looked back toward the house, I saw something that froze me in place. The window, the mirror, it was glowing faintly. Not a bright light, but an eerie, pale shimmer. And in the reflection, I could see it. The woman, her eyes locked onto mine. I turned and ran again, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That whatever was in that house, whatever was in that mirror, wasn't done with me. I had been driving for what felt like hours, the endless stretch of highway surrounding me in a sea of darkness. The night was heavy, the kind of stillness that made it feel like the world had stopped moving. My car's headlights barely cut through the fog that clung to the road, and I was starting to feel the weariness from a long, stressful week. I was on my way home after a business trip, the last leg of my journey. I had been on the road for what seemed like forever, and just when I thought I might make it, my car's fuel gauge light blinked on. Great, I thought, of course this would happen now, in the middle of nowhere. I pulled off at the next exit, hoping to find a gas station, but as I drove down the desolate road, I realized how quiet everything was. Not a single house, not a single light in sight. The road seemed to narrow as it twisted into the trees, and I started to feel the sense of isolation creeping in. Finally, after a few more miles, I saw a small sign. Gas station next right. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned into the driveway of a rundown, old station. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The gas pumps were rusted, the neon lights barely flickered, and the small building resembled a shack more than an actual store. But I needed gas, and I wasn't in any position to be picky. As I stepped out of the car, the sound of my shoes crunching on the gravel felt unnaturally loud in the still night. The door to the station creaked open and I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, filled with the stale scent of dust and oil. The only person inside was an older man standing behind the counter. He had a rough, weathered face and his eyes were half-lidded, like he hadn't slept in days. "Evening," he said, his voice rough, almost inaudible. "Need something?" "Gas," I replied, trying to sound casual. "And maybe something to drink?" The man didn't respond at first. He just stared at me, his gaze unnerving in its intensity. Finally, he gestured toward the back of the store. "There's a vending machine in the corner. Drinks are in there." I nodded, uneasy, and turned to walk toward the vending machine. It was a small, battered machine that looked like it had seen better days. As I fumbled for some change in my pocket, I heard the creaking of the front door. A man walked in. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, and his face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. There was something about the way he moved that sent a chill down my spine, slow, deliberate, like he was stalking me. I turned to glance at him, but the man was already standing by the counter, speaking with the old attendant in low tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, suffocating. I tried to ignore them, but my gaze kept drifting back to the man. Something about his posture, his presence, unsettled me. "Everything all right, miss?" The clerk's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned back to see him watching me closely, his eyes no longer half-lidded. His expression was suddenly sharp, alert. "Yeah, just needed a drink," I said, quickly grabbing a bottle from the vending machine. As I headed back to the counter, the man in the coat was standing by the door, his back to me. I could feel him watching me, even though I couldn't see his face. He turned just as I was about to walk past him, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met. His gaze wasn't just unsettling, it was hungry. A feeling washed over me, one of deep, primal fear, like I had just locked eyes with something that wasn't human. Without thinking, I walked quickly to the counter, trying to get my things and leave as fast as possible. The clerk was holding out the receipt for my gas and drink, but his expression had changed again. He wasn't smiling anymore. His lips were tight, his eyes focused on something behind me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I spun around, my heart racing. The man in the coat was on the floor, writhing. His coat had fallen open, revealing a grotesque, dark shape that seemed to pulse, moving unnaturally under his skin. It looked like something was trying to push its way out of him. His chest contorted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The clerk stepped back, his face blank. He muttered something under his breath, a low chant too quiet for me to understand. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The man in the coat stopped moving. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the man stood up again. He was different now. His face was still hidden beneath the hat, but there was something wrong about his presence. He seemed taller, almost like he was towering over me. He took a slow step forward and I froze. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the door, not looking back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and I tore out of the driveway, not daring to look in my rearview mirror. As I drove away, I glanced in the side mirror, catching one last glimpse of the gas station in the distance. The lights flickered off one by one. I didn't know what had happened inside that place, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I made it home by dawn, but something felt wrong. My mind kept replaying the image of that man, of whatever he was, and the way his body had twisted in the most unnatural way. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, I could still hear the clerk's voice, barely audible over the wind. "Don't stop next time." I had rented a small cabin in the woods for the weekend, hoping to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The drive out there had been long and quiet, the winding road leading me further into the wilderness. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin, a cozy, rustic place tucked away among the trees. It felt isolated, peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first evening passed without incident. I made dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no television, and no distractions, which was exactly why I'd chosen it. I needed a break from everything. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke to a strange sound, a soft, faint whispering like voices in the distance. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the whispering was so quiet I couldn't make out any words. It was odd, but I told myself it was probably just the wind rustling through the trees outside. The cabin was old after all. It could be the sound of the wood creaking or maybe animals scurrying around the foundation. But then I heard it again. It was coming from inside the cabin. I held my breath, listening intently. The whispering seemed to come from the corners of the room, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. I was frozen in place, a chill crawling up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. With trembling hands, I reached for the lamp on the nightstand and flicked it on. The light flooded the room and the shadows receded. The whispering stopped instantly. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. The night was too quiet, the cabin too still. The weight of the silence after the noise felt almost suffocating. I tried to lie back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to check the cabin. I started with the small living area. There was nothing unusual, just the cozy furniture and the dim glow from the fire still burning in the fireplace. I moved toward the kitchen, then the bathroom, but everything was normal. Finally, I reached the basement door. I paused, hand on the old brass knob. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beneath beckoning me with an almost magnetic pull. I could have sworn I heard something moving down there, a rustling like someone shifting through papers or dragging something heavy across the floor. I hesitated. I should have just gone back to bed. But curiosity gnawed at me. What if there was someone in the cabin? What if I wasn't alone? I descended the stairs slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick, inky blackness. My feet made no sound as I stepped onto the concrete floor of the basement. The air was cold, damp. The whispering had returned, but now it was clearer, more urgent. I followed the sound until I reached the far corner of the basement, where a large wooden crate sat. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside it. I hesitated again, my mind racing. What if it was just rats or some other animal trapped inside? Or worse, what if there was someone or something inside? I lifted the lid, the creaking noise echoing through the room. Inside the crate there was nothing. Just dust, cobwebs, and old, discarded furniture. But as I shone my flashlight around the area, something caught my eye. A smear of dark red, almost black, across the floor, leading into the farthest corner of the basement. My stomach dropped. It wasn't blood. It couldn't be. I moved closer to inspect it, and that's when I saw it. An old photograph half buried under the debris. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The photo was black and white, faded with age, showing a group of people standing outside the very cabin I was in. They were all smiling, but there was something wrong about the way their eyes looked. Empty, hollow. And in the corner of the photograph there was a shadow. A dark shape that didn't quite belong, as if something was standing just outside the frame. I turned the photo over. They never leave. I dropped the photograph, my heart racing. The whispering had stopped, but something felt worse than before. I felt it. Something was in the room with me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my flashlight flickered as if struggling to stay on. I spun around, and for a split second I saw a figure standing at the foot of the stairs. It was a shadow, but it had the shape of a person, tall, thin, with outstretched arms. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette against the dim light of the basement. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the figure didn't move, just stood there watching me. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't even look back as I bolted for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably, until finally I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. I didn't even grab my things. I ran to my car, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I reached the nearest town. When I called the owner of the cabin the next morning, they seemed puzzled. "No one's ever stayed there for long," they said almost casually. "It's an old family property. I don't think anyone's lived there in years." But they never mentioned the photo, or the shadows, or the whispers. I haven't gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes in the quiet of the night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear them. The whispers calling my name, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me and a hiking trail in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you could disconnect from everything. No cell service, no distractions, just the wilderness. I'd chosen a remote cabin in the woods, far from any towns or other cabins. I'd rented it specifically for the isolation. It was perfect for someone like me who needed a break from the constant pressure of work. The first night was peaceful. The cabin was small but charming, with wooden floors and a fireplace that crackled with warmth. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees outside and the occasional call of a distant animal. I went to bed early, feeling content. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The cabin was pitch dark and the air was unnervingly still. But then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound coming from outside the window. It was soft, almost like a hum, but not quite. It was rhythmic, steady, and I couldn't place its source. I lay there listening intently. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, but something in the back of my mind told me it was something else. The noise grew louder, closer, like it was coming from just outside the cabin. It was a sound that didn't belong in the woods. It was almost mechanical. Unable to ignore it any longer, I climbed out of bed and peered out the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dark expanse of trees stretching out into the night. But then, near the tree line, I saw it. A faint glow, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to hover just above the ground. It flickered like a candle, but it was too bright to be one. The humming sound intensified, and I felt a strange compulsion to go outside to investigate. It was like the light was calling me, drawing me toward it. My rational mind screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning, but my body was already moving, heading toward the door. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my skin like a slap. The light was brighter now, just a short distance away, bobbing and swaying in the trees. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, almost deafening as I drew closer. I reached the edge of the forest and stepped into the clearing where the light hovered. It wasn't a fire or a lantern or anything natural. It was spherical, glowing with a soft, bluish-white light, and it hovered just above the ground. As I stared at it, the humming sound morphed into something otherworldly. A strange buzzing vibration filled the air around me, making my teeth ache and my head spin. Then it moved. The light shifted in an unnatural way, darting back and forth in quick, erratic motions. It was as if it was alive, something sentient, watching me. I instinctively took a step back, my breath coming faster. Suddenly, it darted forward, stopping just inches from my face. I froze, unable to move or speak. The light seemed to flicker, dim, and then grow brighter again, almost like it was trying to communicate with me. The buzzing sound intensified, filling my head with a pressure I couldn't escape. It felt like the air around me was thickening, like I was breathing through water. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light shot straight up into the sky, vanishing into the trees above. I stood there, completely still, for several long moments. The buzzing sound had stopped, and the night was unnervingly silent again. The normal sounds of the woods, wind, crickets, rustling leaves, seemed muffled, distant. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I hallucinated it? Was I just tired, or had something else really happened? I made my way back to the cabin, my legs shaky, my hands cold as I turned the doorknob. I locked the door behind me and sat down in front of the fireplace, trying to calm my breathing. It was just a light, I told myself. There was no reason to panic. But then, just as I began to convince myself that I had imagined it, I heard it again. The humming. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it was unmistakable. I stood up, heart racing. I glanced out the window again. The trees were still. No lights. No movement. But the sound was there, closer this time. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, hiding in the shadows, hoping that whatever it was would go away. The noise seemed to grow louder, closer, until it was inside my head. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was like the sound was wrapping around me, constricting, suffocating. Then a knock. 3 taps on the door. My heart nearly stopped. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew better. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I swung open the door. Nothing. The forest was completely still. No glowing light. No hum. Just the cold, dark woods. It was as if everything had been a dream, a strange and unsettling dream that never really happened. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my chest heaving. My mind was racing. Had I really seen something? Or had the isolation, the darkness gotten to me? The humming stopped again, but the silence was worse. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy tension. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin, never looking back. I still don't know what it was that night, the light, the hum, the tapping at the door. But I know one thing for sure, I've never returned to that cabin. And I never will. Every now and then, though, when I'm driving late at night, I see it. A flash of light on the side of the road. The same soft, pulsing glow. And I can't help but wonder, am I being followed? Or am I just waiting for it to find me again? It was the kind of stormy night that made you question why you ever left the safety of your warm bed. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windows, and the wind howled like some ancient, vengeful thing. I had been on my own for a few days at the old farmhouse I'd rented out in the countryside. No neighbors for miles, no distractions, just peace and quiet. I thought it would be the perfect escape from my chaotic life, but that night, it felt wrong. I had just finished a late dinner when the power went out. The lights flickered and then died completely, leaving me in the dark with only the sounds of the storm outside. I stumbled around the kitchen, gathering candles from the cabinets, trying to light them with shaking hands. The flickering light felt strange in the silence of the house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After a few moments, I managed to get the candles lit and set them on the table, hoping to find some comfort in the soft glow. I decided to head upstairs and get ready for bed. But as I passed the front door, I heard it, a knock. Just one soft, almost tentative. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? I was miles from the nearest road, and no one had been near the house since I'd arrived. My first thought was to ignore it, but then it came again. A second knock, followed by a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "Let me in?" I froze. The voice sounded strained, desperate, but there was something off about it, something wrong. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. I didn't want to open the door. Everything in my body screamed at me to stay away, to ignore it and go upstairs, but curiosity gnawed at me. Who would be out there in a storm like this? Against my better judgment, I walked slowly to the door and peeked through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but the dark, wet night. But then something shifted. A figure. Tall, almost unnaturally so. A man, though his features were indistinct, shadowed by the rain and night. His face seemed blurry, like I was looking through fogged glass. His hands were pressed against the door, and his head tilted at an odd angle, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. "Let me in," he whispered again. This time I could hear the tremor in his voice, the desperation, and a chill ran down my spine. It didn't sound human anymore. It was something other. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Should I just leave? But I didn't have a phone, and I wasn't about to venture out into that storm. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could take a step, I heard the door creak. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The door had opened. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back. The door was ajar, just a few inches, as if someone had pushed it open from the outside. But I hadn't heard the door unlock. I hadn't even heard it move. I stood frozen, staring at the gap in the door. The wind howled outside, sending a rush of cold air through the crack. The whispering continued, but now it wasn't just one voice. It was several layered over each other, repeating the same phrase in eerie unison. "Let me in, let me in." I turned and ran up the stairs, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I locked the bedroom door behind me, my hands slick with sweat. The house felt suffocating now, like it was closing in around me. The whispers were louder now, reverberating through the walls. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I just needed to escape. I stumbled to the window and peeked outside. Through the torrential rain, I could make out something, movement. The figure. He was standing in the yard, staring up at the window. His face was still obscured, but now I could see that his head was tilted too far back, as though his neck had been snapped. His body was unnaturally still, like he wasn't even human anymore. Then he moved, slowly. His head tilted forward, and in that moment I saw his eyes. They were wide open, black as night, staring directly at me. A smile stretched across his face, if you could call it that. It was a twisted, grotesque thing, as though his lips had been pulled back too far. And the voice, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear. It was a command. "Let me in." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But then something strange happened. The house creaked and the whisper stopped. The figure outside slowly backed away, disappearing into the dark, leaving me in a heavy silence. The door, it slowly clicked shut on its own. I didn't dare leave the room for the rest of the night. I could still hear the wind howling outside, but the storm had passed. When I finally dared to look out the window again at dawn, the yard was empty. There was no sign of the man. No footprints in the mud. Nothing. I left the house the next morning, not even bothering to pack my things. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside was still there, waiting for me to return. I've never been back to that farmhouse. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint whispering like someone is standing just outside my door, waiting, and the words are always the same. "Let me in." I had never been afraid of mirrors. As a kid, I was fascinated by them. I would spend hours staring into the glass, testing how many times I could blink before my reflection started to look wrong, or how long I could keep my eyes fixed before it felt like my own image would stare back at me. That's why, when I found the old antique mirror at a second-hand store in the small town I was passing through, I couldn't resist buying it. It was beautiful, framed in dark wood, intricate patterns carved into the edges. The glass was slightly cloudy, but it had a certain charm to it. The kind of thing that looked like it had a story to tell. I took it back to the small apartment I'd rented, hung it in the hallway where the light from the living room would catch it just right. At first, everything seemed normal. The mirror reflected my own tired face each time I passed by. But after a few days, I began to notice something strange. I don't know when it started exactly, but one morning I glanced at the mirror as I walked past and saw it. Someone else, standing behind me. I froze, heart pounding, turning around quickly. But no one was there. Just the empty hallway, the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was exhausted after all. The move had been stressful, and I wasn't used to the quiet of the apartment. So I ignored it and went about my day. But over the next few days, it happened again. The figure in the mirror. At first, it was just a faint outline, like a shadow too indistinct to make out clearly. But every time I looked, it seemed to grow more defined, more solid. Sometimes the figure was tall, other times short. Sometimes it was facing me, sometimes it had its back turned. But no matter what, it was always there, standing just behind me. I started to avoid the hallway altogether. I stopped looking into the mirror. But that only seemed to make it worse. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt that undeniable pull, as if the glass itself was calling to me, drawing me in. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, daring the figure to show itself again. And it did. The figure emerged slowly from the shadow, and this time I saw it clearly. It was a man, tall, with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted grin stretched across his face. His features were blurry like something out of a nightmare, but his presence was unmistakable. He was smiling at me, not the way someone smiles in a friendly way, but with a sort of knowing, predatory expression. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the man in the mirror didn't move. He stayed there, his eyes never leaving mine, his smile widening as if he could see my fear, feeding off it. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. The glass shimmered as though it was no longer solid, and I could feel a cold, unnatural air surrounding me. I turned to run, but the mirror seemed to pull at my soul, forcing me to stay. The man's fingers, long, thin, and claw-like, reached out, touching the glass. Slowly, he began to emerge from the mirror. His hand was pressed against the glass, and as I looked, I realized his fingers weren't just touching it. They were breaking through it. The sound of cracking glass filled the room. I backed away, but it felt like the space between us was shrinking. The man's figure became more and more corporeal, his face twisting into a grotesque mockery of a grin. "Let me out," he whispered, his voice a low rasp that seemed to echo in the corners of my mind. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door to the apartment behind me, but I could still hear the whispering. It was muffled at first, but as the seconds dragged on, it grew louder, clearer. "Let me out." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed huddled on the couch, clutching my phone, too terrified to even turn the lights off. The next morning, I left the apartment. I didn't care about the rent or the lease. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I shoved the mirror into the back of my car, locked the door, and drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a small town far from where I'd lived. I thought I was free of it, free of the thing in the mirror. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see him. His face, that twisted grin, his fingers reaching through the glass. And sometimes in the dark of night, I swear I hear his voice. "Let me out." I hadn't planned on staying in the old house for long. It was a temporary arrangement, just a few weeks until I found something better. A quiet, small cottage in the middle of nowhere, with peeling paint on the outside and creaky wooden floors on the inside. The rent was cheap, and the landlord was eager to have someone occupy it, so I signed the lease and moved in. The first night was uneventful. The house was cold, drafty, and smelled of mildew, but I didn't mind. It was a place to sleep, a place to get away from the hustle and noise of the city. But on the second night, things changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling like something moving in the walls. I lay still in bed, straining to hear. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Something was scratching, scraping against the wood behind the drywall. At first, I assumed it was rats or some other kind of small creature. The house was old after all. I rolled over, pulled the covers up, and tried to ignore it, but the sound continued, persistent and unnerving. In the morning, I checked the house. I inspected the walls for any signs of damage or holes where something could have gotten in. Nothing. The walls were intact, no signs of rodents or pests. So I shrugged it off and went about my day thinking I had just imagined it. But that night it happened again. The scratching, the tapping, louder this time. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way out from inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The noise grew more frantic, almost desperate, like whatever it was had become agitated. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and started searching the house. I knocked on the walls, listening for any hollow spots that might indicate a hidden space. I checked the attic, the basement, even the old closets, but there was nothing. The house was empty, no animals, no hidden passages, no secret rooms. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I spoke to the landlord about the noises. He seemed almost unfazed, as if it were something he had heard before. "Old houses do that," he said with a shrug. "Settling, creaking, things moving around. It's normal." But I wasn't convinced. This wasn't just the house settling. The noises were too deliberate, too alive. I could almost feel something watching me when I was alone in the house, something inside the walls. The third night I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it. Armed with a hammer and a crowbar, I stood in front of the wall where the sound had been the loudest. The scratching had stopped for a while, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it started again. I began to tear into the drywall. The first few strikes were easy. The old plaster came away with little resistance, and I pulled the pieces aside, revealing the wooden studs behind the wall. As I dug deeper, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And then I heard it again, the scratching. But this time it wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just the shadows and the sound of my own breathing. But I felt it. Something was close, too close. I could almost hear the slow, deliberate breathing, like someone or something was standing just behind me. Then the wall gave way. I pulled away the final piece of plaster, revealing a small, narrow space behind the wall. It was dark, suffocatingly so, and I couldn't make out anything at first. But then my flashlight beam caught something. Eyes. Two small, glowing eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed from the space behind the wall. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The eyes blinked, then a hand, pale, too long and covered in veins, reached out from the hole. I froze, unable to move as the hand slowly, deliberately stretched toward me. It wasn't human. It was too long, too thin, like something that had been hidden in the dark for far too long. I ran. I didn't even think. I dropped the flashlight, tore out of the room, and bolted for the front door. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the rain, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, silent again. The storm had picked up, and the wind howled, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I didn't go back inside that night, or any other night after that. I called the landlord and told him I was leaving. He didn't argue, just seemed to accept it with the same indifferent shrug. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it, just for a moment. A face pressed against the second-floor window, pale, gaunt, with dark eyes staring at me through the glass. I never went back to that house, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it again, the scratching. Soft at first, then growing louder, more frantic, like something is trying to escape. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear breathing. Not from outside my window, but from inside the walls. I'd always loved the idea of living alone in a quiet house, far away from the distractions of the world. That's why I rented an old cottage on the edge of a forest. It was remote, peaceful, exactly what I needed to escape the bustle of city life. The first few days were perfect. The sound of the wind in the trees, the occasional bird call, the stillness of the night, it was everything I had dreamed of. But on the fourth evening, something changed. A storm rolled in. It started with the wind picking up, rattling the windows. The sky turned a shade of gray that seemed to swallow everything. The rain came in sheets, drumming against the roof like 1,000 tiny hands. I didn't mind the storm. It felt cozy inside with the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. But as the night wore on, the storm didn't let up. It only grew worse, and I started to feel uneasy. A sense of being watched, maybe? Or was it just the isolation starting to play tricks on my mind? Around midnight, the knocking started. At first, it was faint, a tap against the door like the wind carrying a branch. But then it came again, louder this time, 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. I hesitated. There was no one out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away. But the knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, heart racing, and walked cautiously to the door. I peered out through the peephole. The porch was empty, the storm swirling in a frenzy outside. No one in sight. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks. Maybe a tree branch hitting the door. I turned to walk away, but the knocking came again, louder. My hand froze on the doorknob. This time I didn't look through the peephole. I opened the door just a crack, my voice shaking as I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" There was nothing at first, just the roar of the storm. But then, in the dim light, I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. A man. He was tall, wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by a hood. His posture was unnaturally straight, like he was frozen in place. He didn't move, didn't respond to my voice. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "Can I help you?" I asked, but the words sounded hollow in the wind. He didn't answer. He just stood there staring at me. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands trembled as I backed away, staring at the door, feeling the heavy silence press in on me. The storm howled louder, but there was no more knocking, just the pounding of my heart. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just some traveler caught in the storm. Maybe he was lost or seeking shelter. But that man, there was something wrong about him. His stillness, the way he didn't speak. I spent the next hour pacing the cottage, the storm growing fiercer by the minute. But there was no more knocking. The wind rattled the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again, this time a sound from inside the house. A soft scraping. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It came from the back of the cottage, near the kitchen. A slow, deliberate scraping, like something dragging across the floor. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and crept toward the back of the house. The scraping continued, now louder, more persistent. I reached the kitchen, but it was empty. The air was cold, the shadows deep. I turned on the light, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the window. The man. He was standing just outside, pressed up against the glass, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his mouth slightly open in a way that made my stomach twist. The same stillness, the same unnatural posture. I gasped and stumbled back. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes never left mine. Then, as if on cue, he raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and tapped against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't think. I ran. I ran through the cottage, grabbing my things, scrambling to get out. I didn't even lock the door behind me as I sprinted into the storm, the rain pouring down in sheets. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the cold air biting at my skin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove through the storm, not looking back, not caring about anything except getting away from that house. But as I drove, I kept seeing him. That figure. His pale face pressed against the window, his unblinking eyes. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the distance, always just out of reach. And the tapping, tap, 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 it followed me. I never returned to that cottage. In fact, I haven't stayed in a place like that since. But sometimes when the wind picks up and the storm clouds gather, I hear it again. A soft tapping just at the edge of my hearing. And I know wherever I am, wherever I go, the man is still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, if I'm alone in the dark, I swear I hear the scrape of his fingers against the glass. I should have known better than to venture into the woods at night, especially after what had happened last winter. But the cabin was so quiet, so isolated, and I couldn't resist. The storm had passed, leaving a damp, chilling fog hanging in the trees. The air felt thick with something unspoken, but I ignored it. I was supposed to be on a weekend getaway to rest, to clear my head. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind howled outside, and I fell asleep easily. But the second night, that was different. I woke to a strange light outside the cabin window. It wasn't the moon because the clouds had blocked out the sky, and it wasn't the firelight either. It was a pale, flickering glow, like a lantern swinging in the distance. I got out of bed, rubbing my eyes, and walked to the window. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. The fog was too thick, and the light seemed to move slowly, almost aimlessly. But I knew it was coming from somewhere near the edge of the woods, closer than it had been when I'd gone to bed. I stood there for a long time, watching it swing back and forth, feeling a cold knot of unease form in my stomach. Who would be out there in the forest in the middle of the night? After a while, I grabbed my jacket and decided to investigate. I told myself it was probably some hunter or hiker, someone lost in the fog. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong about the light. Something off. I stepped outside, the air biting at my skin. The fog was thick, swirling around me, making everything feel suffocatingly close. I could hear the soft crunch of my boots on the wet ground as I walked toward the edge of the woods, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The light was still there, barely visible through the mist, a pale dot, drifting in and out of sight. Then I heard it, a soft, distant voice calling my name. I froze. The voice was too familiar, too real. Sophie? It wasn't just the wind. It was my name, clear and unmistakable. But there was something wrong with it. The way it echoed in the fog, like a faint whisper from far away, and yet right behind me. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment I considered turning back. But the light was closer now, just a few paces ahead. My curiosity got the best of me, and I moved forward, following the pale glow, the voice growing softer, almost coaxing. Sophie, come closer. I couldn't stop myself. It was like the voice was pulling me in, wrapping around my thoughts, drawing me toward the woods. I stepped into the trees, the fog thickening with every step. The light was no longer floating. Now it was swinging slowly, like someone holding it in their hands, walking ahead of me. The voice came again, this time more insistent. Sophie, you've been waiting for me. I stopped dead in my tracks, suddenly aware of how silent it had become. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the eerie quiet of the fog pressing in around me. I tried to call out, to demand who it was, but my throat closed up. I couldn't breathe. The only sound was the faint flickering of the light, and that voice, softer now but still clear. Sophie? I glanced around. My eyes were adjusting to the fog, but there was no one. The light swayed again, and I took a hesitant step forward. My feet felt like they were sinking into the earth. The further I walked, the darker it became, the fog heavier. The light flickered out of view, and panic crept into my chest. The voice was gone too, leaving only the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the trees, sharp and biting. I spun around, but there was no light, no sign of where I'd come from. I was disoriented, lost in the fog, with no sense of direction. My pulse raced, and the fog seemed to close in tighter, suffocating. Then I heard it again. A laugh. It was quiet at first, just a faint chuckle, but then it grew louder. It was a voice, but not a human voice. It was distorted, twisted, like someone was trying to mimic a laugh but couldn't quite get it right. I spun around, my heart in my throat, searching through the fog for the source. Sophie, you can't leave. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that laugh, from that voice that was calling my name. My feet sank into the mud, and the fog wrapped around me like a blanket, pulling me down into the earth. I stumbled, my breath ragged, my hands reaching out for anything, but there was nothing. The trees blurred into shadow, and the light was gone. Finally, I broke through the fog. The cabin appeared in front of me, faint in the distance, but it was there. I didn't stop to think. I ran straight toward it, slamming the door shut behind me as soon as I was inside. I collapsed against the door, gasping for air. The cabin was silent. The storm was over. The only sound was my racing heartbeat. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I left the cabin. I didn't pack my things. I didn't even think about it. I just got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I was far away, back in the city, in the familiar noise and bustle. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the voice again. Soft, distant. calling my name. Sophie, come back. And I know deep down that the light is still out there in the fog, waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a weekend getaway to a small bed and breakfast in the countryside, a break from the relentless stress of work and city life. The owner, an older woman named Margaret, greeted me with a warm smile when I arrived, her home cozy and quiet, nestled between thick woods that seemed to go on forever. The first night passed uneventfully. I had a hearty dinner, a glass of wine, and went to bed early, eager to enjoy the solitude. The bed was comfortable, the room perfectly still, until around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of someone whispering. It was soft at first, distant, like a conversation happening somewhere in the hallway. I frowned and listened. There were no other guests. Margaret had mentioned that I was the only one staying at the B&B for the weekend. So who was it? I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers were closer now, almost right outside my door. I got up, hesitated, then quietly crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. They all whispered in hushed tones, the words incomprehensible but laced with urgency. My heart began to race. Was someone else in the house? But I hadn't heard any other doors open, no footsteps on the stairs. I checked the window, dark and quiet outside, nothing but the dense trees. I shook off the unease and went back to bed, telling myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind. Old house noises. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. I could hear phrases now, snippets of words that made no sense, overlapping in a way that was almost agonizing. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seeped in, relentless, growing clearer by the second. Leave now. It's too late, they're coming. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door and threw it open, expecting to see anyone standing there. But there was no one. The hallway was empty, the air still. The whispers ceased immediately, as if they had been waiting for me to open the door. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Nothing. The hallway was unnervingly quiet now. I turned on every light and checked every room in the house, but everything was just as I had left it. The stairs creaked as I made my way down to the kitchen, but the house remained empty, still. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen counter, under the dim light, was a piece of paper. I hadn't seen it before, and it didn't belong to me. The handwriting was strange, jagged, hurried, as if written in a panic. They never leave. They're always listening. I froze. There was no way Margaret could have left this. She had been upstairs, and I had seen her go to bed hours earlier. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the whispers came again, more insistent this time, more desperate. They hear you. They hear everything. I turned to leave the kitchen, but as I did, I saw it. A shadow. It was barely perceptible at first, standing just at the edge of the kitchen doorway, barely lit by the light in the hall. A figure, tall, cloaked in black, with no face, just a void. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there watching. I knew instantly that it wasn't human, that it didn't belong in this world. The longer I stared, the more the air around it seemed to thicken, like the darkness itself was wrapping around me. The whispers came again, now a cacophony in my mind, louder and more urgent than before. I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It didn't move, but somehow it felt like it was getting closer, closing the distance between us. And then, the voice that had been whispering all night spoke clearly, directly in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from whatever that thing was. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't even take my phone. I bolted out the front door, leaving the B&B behind, the cold night air biting at my skin. I ran until I reached the nearest town, not stopping until I was safely in a hotel room, far from that house, that dark presence. But even as I sat there trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there listening. I left the B&B the next morning without even speaking to Margaret. I told her I had an emergency, that I needed to leave early, and she didn't ask any questions. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the lights of the B&B in the distance. But there was something wrong with them. The windows were all dark. No lights. No signs of life. I never went back, and I never will. But every now and then, in the quiet of the night, I hear those whispers again. Soft, indistinct, but unmistakable. They're coming. The rain had been pouring relentlessly for hours. I sat in the tiny room of the old inn, staring out the fogged-up window as the wind howled outside. The place had seemed charming at first, quaint even, but now it felt off. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the air in the inn made my skin crawl. The innkeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Green, had been kind enough, though distant. She gave me a warm welcome, a cup of tea, and a key to room 206, a small, musty room near the back of the building. It was all I needed, a place to rest for the night before heading out again in the morning. But then the door to room 206 had refused to close properly. At first, I chalked it up to old hinges, but when I returned from dinner, the door was slightly ajar, as though someone had been inside while I was out. I double-checked the lock before going to bed, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. A soft clicking like a key turning in a lock. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to orient myself in the darkness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something was messing with the lock on the door. I swung my legs off the bed, the cold wooden floor sending a shiver up my spine. I hesitated before getting up and tiptoeing to the door, holding my breath, praying that it was just the wind. Then, as clear as day, I heard it. A soft, whispering voice coming from just outside the door. It was muffled, as if the speaker was trying to keep their voice down, but I could hear the words clearly. "Let me in. Please let me in." My blood turned cold. I backed away from the door, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I should have called out to the innkeeper, asked if there was someone else in the building. But I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, as the voice grew more insistent. "Please, I need to get in. I need your help. Let me in." I didn't know what to do. The rational part of my mind told me to ignore it, to stay in bed and pretend I hadn't heard. But the fear gnawing at my insides urged me to take action. I grabbed the phone on the nightstand and dialed the front desk, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Green answered after the second ring, sounding groggy and annoyed. "Yes. There's someone outside my room," I said, my throat dry. "I don't know who they are, but they're trying to get in." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Mrs. Green's voice, low and careful, said, "There's no one else in the inn tonight. No one except you." I could feel the blood drain from my face. But the phone line went dead. I stood there, frozen, holding the receiver in my shaking hand. The silence in the room was deafening. The voice had stopped, but I could still feel it lingering like a weight in the air. The door to my room creaked as if something was testing the lock again. "Let me in. Let me in." I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, my hand gripping the knob. I swung it open, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. No one. Just the old, dimly lit walls of the inn stretching out in front of me. I stepped into the hall, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I looked both ways, but all I saw were the faded carpets and closed doors. Everything was still. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The voice hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from inside the door, inside the room itself. The door was slightly ajar again. I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. It wasn't the hinges that had failed. Someone had been inside. Someone who shouldn't have been. I slowly pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, just as I had left it, but as I stepped inside, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the room by the window stood a figure, a woman, her back to me. She was tall, thin, with dark, tangled hair falling over her shoulders. Her clothing was old-fashioned, like something from another time, and her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The woman didn't respond. I took a step forward, but then something made me stop. I looked at the floor, and there, just beside the bed, was a key. A key to the room, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't Mrs. Green's either. It looked old, rusted, and out of place. I bent down to pick it up, and when I looked up, the woman was gone. I spun around, my heart racing. The room was empty, silent, save for the steady dripping of water from the ceiling. But the air felt heavier now, like something had changed. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, darker. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag, and didn't even bother to lock the door behind me as I bolted from the room. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I ran down the stairs, through the lobby, and straight out the front door into the pouring rain. The night air was thick and cold, but I didn't care. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest gas station, far from the inn, far from whatever I had just experienced. The next morning, I went back to the inn to check out, but when I arrived, I was greeted by an unsettling silence. Mrs. Green wasn't at the front desk. There was no sign of life anywhere in the building. The place felt abandoned. I asked the man working the gas station down the road if he knew anything about the inn, and his face went pale. "Everyone knows that place is haunted," he said, shaking his head. "You're lucky you got out." "Haunted?" I asked, my voice thick with disbelief. He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, no one stays there anymore. The woman who owned it, well, she disappeared years ago. Left everything behind. The inn, the rooms, the guests. People say she's still there, walking the halls, trying to let herself in." I didn't know what to say. I didn't return to the inn that day. In fact, I haven't been able to get it out of my mind since. And sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I swear I hear the soft clicking of a key turning in a lock. "Let me in." I had always been a fan of staying in old, forgotten places. It wasn't that I loved the history or the charm of them, but more that they had a sense of stillness, a sense of being untouched by time. So when I found a rundown motel on the edge of a small town, I didn't hesitate. It was just a one-night stop on a long road trip, and the rainstorm outside made me long for shelter. The motel was an eyesore. A faded neon sign buzzed above the entrance, and the parking lot was almost empty, save for a few cars that looked abandoned. The lobby smelled musty, like mold and old paper, but the desk clerk, a man in his late 50s with a gray beard, greeted me with a polite, if tired, smile. "Room 3, he said, handing me a key, top of the stairs. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't a place for luxury, but it would do. The room was dark, damp, and cold, but it was a bed, and I was exhausted. I set my things down and began to unpack. The air in the room smelled stale, and the walls were thin. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the room. There was an old dresser against the wall with a small oval mirror hanging above it. It was tarnished, the glass streaked with age, but I didn't think anything of it. After a quick shower, I settled in with a book, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort that gnawed at me. The rain tapped against the window, but the sound was muffled, like the storm was far off. The only other noise in the room was the occasional sound of the building settling, a groan, a rattle, a squeak from the ceiling above. It wasn't until I turned off the lights and climbed into bed that things began to feel wrong. The room was pitch black now, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the mirror. A shape, something shifting in the glass. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared at the mirror, the clearer it became. There was a man standing in it. I jerked upright in bed, my heart racing. The reflection was distorted, blurry and shifting as if he was moving but not quite right. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing an old-fashioned suit. His face was a blur, but his posture was straight, rigid, as if he were standing at attention. I blinked and he was gone. The mirror was just a mirror. Empty. No one there. I felt silly. It was nothing. Just a trick of the mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned the light on, but the mirror still felt wrong. As if it were a window into a place I didn't belong. I avoided looking at it, choosing to focus on the shadows in the corner of the room instead. But every time I glanced at the mirror, I saw him again. That figure, standing still watching me. His face was still blurred, but now I could see a faint outline, pale skin, hollow eyes, a thin mouth stretched into a grimace. My pulse quickened. I threw the covers off and rushed to the door, intending to leave, but when I opened it, the hallway was dark and silent. No one around. Just the same eerie quiet that had followed me since I arrived. I slammed the door shut and backed away. My eyes were drawn to the mirror again. He was there again. This time he was closer. I couldn't look away. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move as the figure in the mirror slowly raised a hand to his face. The motion was unnatural, jerky, like he was moving against some invisible force. He brought his hand to his mouth and smiled. A wide, ghastly smile. The corners of his lips stretched too far, too wide, and the skin around his mouth pulled tight, revealing yellow teeth, too many teeth. His eyes locked with mine through the glass, black holes where pupils should have been. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath came in shallow gasps as I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. No, this isn't real. I turned away from the mirror, desperate to leave the room, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted in place. The air felt heavy, thick, as though something was pressing down on me, pulling me toward the reflection. I could feel the man in the mirror behind me now, his presence creeping into the room like a shadow. His smile widened. His hollow eyes burned into me. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was low at first, but growing louder. "I'm behind you." I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The mirror was empty. Just a reflection of my terrified self. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the whisper came again. "I'm behind you." This time I didn't hesitate. I turned and fled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran down the hallway to the stairs, ignoring the curious glances from the few other guests in the building. My heart pounded in my chest as I barreled into the lobby. The desk clerk was still there, reading a newspaper. I rushed up to him out of breath and asked, Who's in room 3? He looked up, puzzled. "Room 3? No one's in there tonight." I stared at him. But I was just there. There was a man in the mirror. The clerk frowned, then set the newspaper down. "There's no man in the mirror, miss. Room 3's been vacant for years. No one stays there." The room felt cold now, and my skin tingled with unease. "What do you mean?" The clerk's expression darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "That room's been empty for a reason. There's a history, you could say. A guest stayed there decades ago, a man who never left. After he checked in, no one saw him again. But people say his reflection still haunts the place, that he's trapped in the mirror." I felt dizzy. "What happened to him?" The clerk's voice dropped to a whisper. "No one knows. But they say if you look long enough, you'll see him. And if he sees you, well, some say he takes you with him." I didn't wait for him to finish. I ran out the door, not looking back until I was safely in my car, driving away from that cursed place. But even now, weeks later, I can't escape the feeling that he is still watching. I can't look into any mirror without thinking I might see that man behind me, smiling. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that whisper again. "I'm behind you." I'd heard the rumors about the old cabin before, the one deep in the woods on the outskirts of town. People said it was cursed, abandoned long ago after something terrible happened. I wasn't superstitious, but when my friends suggested we spend a weekend there for a break from the city, I shrugged and agreed. What's the worst that could happen, right? The cabin was hard to find. We had to hike through dense trees, twisting trails, and unmarked paths until we finally saw it, standing crooked and dilapidated in a clearing. It looked more like a rotting relic of the past than anything remotely habitable. The windows were boarded up, and the front door creaked ominously when we opened it. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but we made ourselves at home, excited for a weekend of isolation. The first night went smoothly. We built a fire, cracked open some drinks, and told ghost stories. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. The air around the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing in from all sides, just waiting to break through. I chalked it up to the cold, the isolation, and the alcohol. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of being watched. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I went to bed in the room upstairs while my friends stayed downstairs. The moment I lay down, the feeling of unease intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The wind had picked up, howling outside, but it wasn't the wind that disturbed me, it was the sound. Footsteps. I heard them above me, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing across the creaky floorboards of the second story. I froze, unsure if it was my mind playing tricks or if there was someone else in the cabin. My friends had gone to bed earlier. I was alone up here. So who? The footsteps stopped. Then a soft tapping, as though someone was lightly knocking on the ceiling directly above my head. I couldn't move. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone to text my friends downstairs, but the message wouldn't send. The signal was gone. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs. I jumped, heart pounding in my chest. I had to check. It couldn't be anything else. I threw the blankets off and crept out of bed, tiptoeing toward the stairs. My bare feet barely made a sound as I ascended to the second floor, my breathing shallow. When I reached the top, I stood still in the dark hallway. The air was colder now, and the house felt wrong, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. The floorboards creaked as I made my way to the source of the sound. I stopped at the door to the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, half expecting to see one of my friends, but the room was empty. The bed was undisturbed. But then I saw it, a small wooden box sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, almost hidden in the shadows. I didn't remember seeing it there before. Curious, I approached it. The moment my fingers touched the lid, a cold chill ran through me. I opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman, her face scratched and blurred. But it wasn't just the woman that made my blood run cold, it was the background of the photo. The cabin. The exact same room I was standing in. I backed away, my heart racing. Something was terribly wrong. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. I heard the footsteps again, but now they were closer. Too close. They were right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I gasped, panic rising. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't open. Something was holding it shut. The whispers began then, soft at first, like distant voices from the corner of the room, but they grew louder, more frantic. They weren't in English, though not exactly. They were guttural, harsh sounds that sent a chill through my spine. I could barely make them out, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. I turned back to the room and saw the dark shape moving in the corner. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. A figure. Tall, thin, and draped in shadow. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unfeeling eyes. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, but then the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided like it was floating above the ground. It came closer, its shape becoming more defined with each step. I could hear the whispers now, louder, sharper, like they were coming from all directions. I needed to get out. No. I ran to the window, throwing it open, the wind and rain pouring in. I didn't look back as I climbed out onto the roof, my fingers slipping on the wet shingles. But before I could make my way down, I heard the door behind me creak open. I didn't dare look. I scrambled down the side of the house, desperate to escape, and jumped into the bushes below. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my lungs burning. The rain pelted me as I dashed through the woods, praying I could find my way back to the car. When I finally made it back to the road, I saw my friends waiting by the car, looking confused. They had no idea what had happened. But I did. The whispers haven't stopped. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes I swear I see shadows moving in my peripheral vision. And the worst part? I keep finding photos in my bag, tucked away between pages of my journal. Photos of the cabin. The same one I thought I had left behind. I never planned on staying in the motel. It was just a stopover on my long drive home, a place to rest and stretch my legs. But when I pulled into the lot, the storm was coming down hard, and the lights of the motel looked like a beacon in the dark. The neon sign buzzed, flickering like it might die out any minute, but it was still warm enough to convince me to check in. The clerk, an old man with a stony face, was surprisingly quiet as he handed me the key to room 12. "You'll be safe here," he said in a gravelly voice. "Just don't leave the room after midnight." I thought it was a strange thing to say, but I nodded and took the key. I'd had my fair share of roadside motels, and the oddities didn't faze me. The room itself was small but clean enough. The bed was lumpy, the carpet worn down, and the window was cracked open just a bit, letting in the smell of wet pavement. After driving for hours, I was too tired to care about the details. I threw my bags on the bed, locked the door behind me, and collapsed under the covers, letting the sound of the rain against the window lull me to sleep. I woke up later to a phone ringing. Groggy and disoriented, I fumbled for the receiver. The clock on the bedside table read 2:04 a.m. "Hello?" There was only silence on the other end. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then, just before I hung up, came a voice. A raspy whisper that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have stayed." I froze. The voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the storm outside. I thought it might have been a prank, someone messing with me. But there was something in that whisper, something that felt real. I glanced around the room, but everything seemed normal. My bags were still on the bed, the window still cracked open, the door still locked. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I sat there, gripping the phone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound confident, but my voice betrayed me. The voice came again, but this time it was closer. It was as if the person was standing right next to me, breathing into the phone. "We've been waiting for you." My heart pounded. I didn't know whether to hang up or wait for the next words, but before I could make a decision, the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long time, my breath coming in shallow bursts. This was ridiculous. Maybe it was some sort of late-night prank from the motel staff or a wrong number. I sat there for a few minutes trying to calm my racing heart, but then something caught my eye. The door. It was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it when I came in. I always lock doors when I travel. I never forget. But now, the handle was turned just enough that I could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. I stood up, heart hammering, and walked cautiously to the door. My mind raced, trying to think of any logical explanation. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly. Maybe I was just imagining things. I pushed the door open. The hallway outside was completely empty, bathed in the dull light from a single overhead bulb. The air was thick and still, and there was no sound except the steady drumming of rain against the windows. I stepped into the hallway, my breath fogging in the cold air. The phone rang again, this time much louder, echoing down the empty corridor. I didn't want to answer, but my hand moved before I could stop it. I grabbed the receiver and put it to my ear. "I told you not to leave the room." My blood ran cold. The voice was clearer this time, unmistakable, but it wasn't just a whisper. It was an order. My mind spun with confusion and fear. I didn't know what was happening, but something inside me told me that I was in danger. I slammed the phone down and bolted out of the room, the sounds of the storm drowning out the beating of my heart. I ran down the stairs, my mind a blur of panic, my feet barely touching the ground. The lobby was empty, no sign of the clerk, no one around. The front door was locked, but I turned the handle and shoved, only to find that it wouldn't budge. I tried again. Nothing. I turned to the lobby, my breath coming faster now. The walls were closing in. There was no exit, no way out. The phone began ringing again, but I couldn't even think about answering it. Suddenly, I saw something move in the corner of the room. A shadow barely visible in the dim light. It was too tall to be human, too wide. I froze. My eyes locked on it as it began to step closer, each step deliberate, its shape more defined as it moved into the light. It was him, the old clerk from the desk. Only he wasn't quite right. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark circles under his eyes. His skin was drawn tight, stretched unnaturally thin over his bones. And his mouth, open in a grotesque grin, was wide enough that I could see teeth, sharp, pointed teeth like an animal's. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but the clerk stepped forward, blocking the only exit. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice now a guttural growl, his grin widening. "You never should have stayed." My body acted before my mind. I bolted past him, throwing open the door to the storm outside. The rain hit me like ice, but I didn't stop. I ran down the street, my legs aching, my breath ragged, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. My car was parked at the diner I had passed on the way in. I didn't even look back at the motel. I just got in, drove as fast as I could, and never returned. I tried to call the motel once the next day to warn anyone who might be staying there. The phone line was disconnected. I tried to Google the place, but there was no record of it. Nothing. As if it had never existed. I don't know who or what was on the other end of that phone, but one thing's for sure. I'm never stopping at a roadside motel again. And if I ever hear that phone ring again, I won't answer. It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful drive back home after visiting my parents for the weekend. Just me, my car, and a long stretch of empty highway. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the world outside was nothing but darkness, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture, and the road ahead shimmered with the last remnants of the storm. I'd been driving for a few hours, my eyes heavy and my mind wandering, when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A car tailing me. At first, I thought it was just another late-night traveler, but as I kept glancing in the mirror, I saw the car hadn't changed its position. It was too close for comfort. I sped up, thinking maybe it would pass, but the car kept pace. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. It was late. Maybe it was a coincidence. Then the headlights flickered. I glanced at the rear view again, but this time the car was no longer behind me. It had vanished. The road was empty, just me and the long stretch of asphalt. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to convince myself it had been nothing, just fatigue. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I continued down the road, I saw a figure ahead, a person standing on the shoulder of the highway. It was odd. Who would be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? I slowed down, my hand tightening on the steering wheel. The figure was a man wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He raised his hand, signaling for a ride. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Need a lift?" I asked as the man came closer to the car, his face obscured by the shadows. I hadn't planned on stopping, but there was something about him, a desperate energy, that made me hesitate. He nodded. "Yeah, if you don't mind." I unlocked the door and he climbed in without another word. As soon as he shut the door, I started driving again, keeping my eyes on the road. The man didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring ahead. I tried to make small talk to fill the silence, but he didn't respond. His eyes were hollow, distant. Finally, I broke the silence again. You're not from around here, are you?" "No," he said, his voice flat. "I'm just passing through." The oddness of his tone made my skin crawl, but I pressed on, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at me. I wasn't sure why, but there was something about this guy that seemed wrong. He was too still, too silent. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. The silence stretched on for miles. I didn't know where he was going, but he didn't ask me to stop. He just sat there, unmoving. Then the headlights flickered again. This time I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the rain on the windshield or the dimness of the road. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No car. Just the endless road stretching behind me. The man suddenly turned his head toward me. His eyes were wide, too wide, and there was something in them, something I couldn't place. He was watching me, studying me. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but more of a twisted, empty grin. "We're almost there," he whispered. My stomach twisted, and I couldn't understand why I was so terrified. Something was wrong. I had to get him out of the car. I had to get away. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever this was. But the more I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch on. Endless, no sign of another car, no sign of civilization. Just the dark highway and the silence between us. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke again. "You know, I didn't need to get in your car." His voice was soft, almost as if he was talking to himself, but it sent a jolt of panic through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The smile on his face grew wider, stretching unnaturally. I was already here. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The car screeched to a halt, and I turned to look at him, my breath coming in short gasps. He was still staring ahead, his eyes vacant, his expression frozen in that chilling smile. "No. No, no, no," I muttered, my hands shaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat as the silence stretched on. I turned the car off, just needing a moment to gather my thoughts. But as I did, I heard something. A soft, faint tapping sound from the back seat. I didn't dare look in the rear view. I couldn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I turned around quickly. The back seat was empty. There was no man. No sign of him at all. I looked at the passenger seat, and it was empty too. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for the door handle. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. The headlights flickered again, and I saw the silhouette of a car coming up behind me. The same car from earlier, the one that had followed me. But this time it wasn't just tailing me. It was speeding up, getting closer, its headlights blinding. I slammed the car into reverse, throwing the gearshift into drive, and I floored the gas pedal. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. But as I sped down the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The car was gone, vanished. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and dark. No sign of anything, no other cars, no lights, nothing. I drove for hours. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. When I finally reached home, I locked the doors and sat in my car, just breathing, trying to calm my pulse, trying to make sense of what had happened. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still hear that tapping from the back seat. The low, insistent sound that never stops. And the worst part? I've just realized the man's face never looked the same when I glanced at him. It's like I saw a different version of him every time. The last time I looked, his smile was gone. But his eyes, they were mine. It was supposed to be a simple, uneventful drive back home after visiting my parents for the weekend. Just me, my car, and a long stretch of empty highway. It was late, around 2 a.m., and the world outside was nothing but darkness, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture, and the road ahead shimmered with the last remnants of the storm. I'd been driving for a few hours, my eyes heavy and my mind wandering, when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A car tailing me. At first, I thought it was just another late-night traveler, but as I kept glancing in the mirror, I saw the car hadn't changed its position. It was too close for comfort. I sped up, thinking maybe it would pass, but the car kept pace. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. It was late. Maybe it was a coincidence. Then the headlights flickered. I glanced at the rear view again, but this time the car was no longer behind me. It had vanished. The road was empty, just me and the long stretch of asphalt. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to convince myself it had been nothing, just fatigue. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I continued down the road, I saw a figure ahead, a person standing on the shoulder of the highway. It was odd. Who would be out here at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? I slowed down, my hand tightening on the steering wheel. The figure was a man wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He raised his hand, signaling for a ride. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Need a lift?" I asked as the man came closer to the car, his face obscured by the shadows. I hadn't planned on stopping, but there was something about him, a desperate energy, that made me hesitate. He nodded. "Yeah, if you don't mind." I unlocked the door and he climbed in without another word. As soon as he shut the door, I started driving again, keeping my eyes on the road. The man didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring ahead. I tried to make small talk to fill the silence, but he didn't respond. His eyes were hollow, distant. Finally, I broke the silence again. You're not from around here, are you?" "No," he said, his voice flat. "I'm just passing through." The oddness of his tone made my skin crawl, but I pressed on, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at me. I wasn't sure why, but there was something about this guy that seemed wrong. He was too still, too silent. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. The silence stretched on for miles. I didn't know where he was going, but he didn't ask me to stop. He just sat there, unmoving. Then the headlights flickered again. This time I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the rain on the windshield or the dimness of the road. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No car. Just the endless road stretching behind me. The man suddenly turned his head toward me. His eyes were wide, too wide, and there was something in them, something I couldn't place. He was watching me, studying me. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, but more of a twisted, empty grin. "We're almost there," he whispered. My stomach twisted, and I couldn't understand why I was so terrified. Something was wrong. I had to get him out of the car. I had to get away. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever this was. But the more I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch on. Endless, no sign of another car, no sign of civilization. Just the dark highway and the silence between us. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke again. "You know, I didn't need to get in your car." His voice was soft, almost as if he was talking to himself, but it sent a jolt of panic through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The smile on his face grew wider, stretching unnaturally. I was already here. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The car screeched to a halt, and I turned to look at him, my breath coming in short gasps. He was still staring ahead, his eyes vacant, his expression frozen in that chilling smile. No, no, I muttered, my hands shaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat as the silence stretched on. I turned the car off, just needing a moment to gather my thoughts. But as I did, I heard something. A soft, faint tapping sound from the back seat. I didn't dare look in the rear view. I couldn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I turned around quickly. The back seat was empty. There was no man, no sign of him at all. I looked at the passenger seat and it was empty too. Panic surged through me and I fumbled for the door handle. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. The headlights flickered again and I saw the silhouette of a car coming up behind me. The same car from earlier, the one that had followed me. But this time it wasn't just tailing me. It was speeding up, getting closer, its headlights blinding. I slammed the car into reverse, throwing the gear shift into drive, and I floored the gas pedal. My heart was racing. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. But as I sped down the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The car was gone, vanished. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and dark. No sign of anything, no other cars, no lights, nothing. I drove for hours. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. When I finally reached home, I locked the doors and sat in my car, just breathing, trying to calm my pulse, trying to make sense of what had happened. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still hear that tapping from the back seat. The low, insistent sound that never stops. And the worst part? I've just realized the man's face never looked the same when I glanced at him. It's like I saw a different version of him every time. The last time I looked, his smile was gone. But his eyes, they were mine. I wasn't supposed to be here. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I had only come to the house to clear out some of the old family stuff. Nothing special, just another errand my aunt had left me after her passing. The house was an old Victorian, crammed with years of memories, some of which I was sure I wasn't meant to uncover. It wasn't the house that unnerved me, it was the attic. Ever since I was a kid, I had heard stories about that attic, how it was full of strange things, how the old mirror up there had odd qualities. But as an adult, I brushed it off as family folklore. Yet still, every time I climbed the creaky stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had arrived early in the morning, the lights still dim and gray outside. My aunt's house was situated at the end of a long, winding road, nestled in the woods, so when I entered the house, it felt as though the outside world had been shut away, forgotten. The attic was exactly as I remembered it. Boxes of books and old furniture, draped in sheets, sat in neat piles. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of aged wood and mothballs hung in the stillness. But what caught my eye immediately wasn't the piles of forgotten memories, but the mirror, the full-length mirror that leaned against the far wall. It wasn't particularly ornate, though it looked old, Victorian like the house itself. But something about the reflection in it felt wrong. It was almost as if the mirror didn't show the room accurately. The angle was slightly off, the shadows in the glass seemed to stretch in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't stop staring at it. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but there was a peculiar unease in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I took a step closer. As I approached the mirror, I felt a chill settle over me. The room around me seemed to blur, the edges of the room warping in the reflection. I raised my hand and placed it against the glass. The surface was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been given the warmth of the house. I pulled my hand back sharply. That's when I saw it. A figure appeared in the mirror, standing just behind me. I froze. The reflection was not of me. It was a woman standing in the corner of the attic. She was pale, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair, and her clothes, well, they were old-fashioned. A long, tattered dress that seemed out of place in the modern world. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the attic was empty. I turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there. She hadn't moved, but her eyes, I could feel them on me, cold, piercing. I blinked hard, trying to force myself to look away, but I couldn't. My feet felt frozen to the floor. The air in the room was growing colder. My breath fogged as if I was standing in a blizzard. I heard the softest whisper, as though someone was standing directly behind me, just out of reach. It It was too faint to make out the words, but I could feel the presence. Slowly, the woman in the reflection lifted her hand just like I had. I could see her thin fingers, long and pale, reaching out toward me. It was like the mirror itself was drawing her closer. The shadows in the room deepened, and the reflection of her hand stretched out unnaturally far, closer and closer toward the glass. I couldn't breathe. The temperature dropped even more. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to flee, something in the reflection caught my eye again. The woman was no longer just standing there. She was moving. Her body jerked forward violently, as though she was trying to escape the confines of the glass, reaching for me with desperate, outstretched arms. The shadows behind her twisted, turning into dark, shifting shapes that seemed to surge toward the mirror's surface. I heard a loud cracking sound as if the glass itself was straining against some unseen force. I spun around, and this time I could see her in the corner of the room with me, standing in the exact spot where she had been in the reflection. Her hair hung over her face, obscuring her features, but I could see her mouth twisted in a silent scream. I bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. But before I reached the door, I heard it, a voice low and raspy just behind me. "You can't leave." I whirled around, and for a split second, the woman was standing right there, inches from me. I could feel her cold breath on my skin, like ice against my neck. The air was so thick with dread I could barely think straight. "You're not leaving until I say so." I don't know how I did it, but I ran. I didn't even look back. I raced down the stairs, through the house, and out into the fresh air. My car was parked just a few yards from the door, and I barely even registered getting inside. All I could think about was the woman's face, the way her mouth twisted in that silent scream. I drove away without a second thought, the road stretching out before me like an endless tunnel. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, just so I could catch my breath and shake the feeling that something was following me. The reflection in the mirror, the woman, everything. When I got home, I tried to tell myself that it had all been a trick of the light, or some strange psychological response to the house, to the stress. But every night since, I can still feel her presence. I've been having nightmares. Night after night, I see her face in the glass, reaching for me. And sometimes I swear I hear a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Come back." I don't know if the mirror still holds her, if she's still trapped there, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever is in that attic, it's not done with me yet. I had always been a creature of habit. I liked my routine, my schedule. Every evening, I caught the 11:15 p.m. train from work back to my apartment. It was quiet, almost empty at that time of night. I'd sit in the same seat, stare out the window, and lose myself in the rhythm of the train as it rattled through the dark, deserted streets of the city. That night, however, something was different. It started when I noticed the train was running late. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly midnight. The station was unusually quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting an eerie glow over the empty platform. There were only a few people waiting, all standing apart, their faces tired and distant. I didn't think much of it. Late trains were a part of city life. I leaned against the wall, scrolling through my phone to kill time, when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, but there was something unsettling about them. I turned around. A man was standing there just a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a long coat, his face hidden beneath a dark fedora. His presence felt off, like he didn't belong in this place. I couldn't place it, but I felt a chill creep up my spine. He didn't look at me. Instead, he was staring at the tracks, his posture stiff and rigid. I went back to my phone, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort gnawing at me. I had no idea why, but I could feel his eyes boring into me, even though he wasn't looking at me. The train finally pulled into the station with a loud screech, its headlights slicing through the darkness. As I got on, I glanced at the man one last time. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at the tracks, his hands clutched tightly around the straps of his coat. I took my usual seat near the window, hoping to just zone out until I reached my stop. The train began to move, its familiar rumbling filling the air, and I settled in for the ride. But something was wrong. The usual hum of the train felt muted. The lights flickered again, casting long, wavering shadows down the aisles. I glanced around. The train car was emptier than usual, only a few passengers scattered about, sitting silently with their heads down. But it wasn't the emptiness that made me uneasy, it was the silence. Normally, the train was filled with the quiet murmurs of people talking, the sound of phones, the occasional cough. But tonight the train felt dead. I shifted in my seat, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing down on me. The walls of the car felt too close, as if the space was shrinking. I glanced at the door leading to the next car, but it was locked. The windows were dark and blurred with condensation. Then a sudden movement caught my eye. The man from the platform. He was sitting a few rows ahead of me in the seat across the aisle. His face was still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but I could feel his presence, like a dark shadow lurking just out of sight. I looked away quickly, my pulse picking up. Why would he get on this train? There were plenty of other people waiting on the platform. Why follow me? I tried to brush it off as nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but the unease in my stomach only grew. Every time I looked at him, his head seemed to shift, just slightly, like he was aware of me, watching me without actually turning his gaze in my direction. I turned my attention back to the window. The train was moving faster now, racing through the dark city, the landscape outside a blur of lights and shadows. But then, the lights flickered again. This time they went out completely. For a second, everything was plunged into darkness. The train car felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. I heard the sound of a door opening somewhere down the train. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking toward me. I froze. I didn't want to turn around, but the sound was unmistakable. The footsteps grew closer, and I felt a pressure in my chest as if the air was becoming heavier, harder to breathe. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. It was barely audible, but I could feel it brushing against the back of my neck. You don't belong here. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The man in the coat had disappeared. The seats were empty. The train car was empty. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted to the other cars, but they were just as dark and silent. I was alone. I grabbed the handle of the door to the next car and yanked it open. The door slid shut behind me with a loud, metallic thud. The next car was just as silent. No one else. No conductor. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The train had plunged into complete darkness. The only sound now was the low, rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding. I tried to calm myself. There had to be an explanation. The power had gone out. Maybe there was a delay. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something was wrong. The train didn't feel like it was moving anymore. The sound of the wheels on the tracks had slowed, becoming faint, distant. I pressed my hand to the glass of the window, trying to see outside, but the glass was fogged over. I wiped it clean with the sleeve of my jacket. For a moment, I just stared at the dark, empty streets. Then I saw it. A figure. Standing in the distance at the edge of the platform where the lights barely reached. A man wearing a dark fedora. It was him. He was waiting for me. I turned and ran down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The train car stretched on forever, the doors at the end just out of reach. My breath came in sharp gasps, and when I finally reached the door, I threw it open and stumbled into the next car. But this time the car was different. It wasn't the next one at all. It was the same car, the same seat, the same empty space. I wasn't on a train anymore. I don't know how long I've been here. The lights never came back on, and the air is thick with the smell of dust. The train still moves, but the city outside is gone. The tracks are silent. and in the distance I hear the sound of footsteps drawing closer. I've never been a fan of camping. I'm more of a hotel with a minibar kind of person. But when my friends insisted on a weekend getaway in the woods, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature, I reluctantly agreed. I was hoping the isolation would be good for me to unplug and unwind. The cabin we rented was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The kind of place where the trees grow so close together that it feels like the sun never really reaches the ground. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the sound of distant birds and rustling leaves was about all you could hear. We arrived in the late afternoon, just before the sun started to dip behind the trees. Our group of 5 was in high spirits, unpacking and settling in. The cabin itself was old, rustic, and charming in that we could get murdered here kind of way. There was a large fireplace, a big, creaky wooden table, and a couple of rooms upstairs. I wasn't sure if it was the creaking of the floorboards or the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, but I didn't feel comfortable. "Stop being such a city person," my friend Sarah teased me as I gave the cabin a final suspicious glance. "It's just the woods. What's the worst that could happen?" I wanted to argue, to tell her that the worst that could happen was that we'd end up on the evening news as missing persons, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my things and followed the others inside. Night fell quickly, and we gathered around the fireplace, cracking open beers and playing card games. The conversation was light-hearted, and for the first few hours I felt myself relaxing. That is, until we heard it. A faint rustling, like footsteps in the underbrush. Not the kind of wind-driven rustling you'd expect, but deliberate, slow, like someone was walking around the cabin. I tried to ignore it at first. It was probably a deer or some other animal. But then it happened again, closer this time. I stood up, my heart racing. I looked out the front window, but all I could see were the black silhouettes of trees against the moonlit sky. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said dismissively. "You're overthinking it." But I wasn't overthinking it. I could hear the steps now, and they were definitely too heavy to be an animal. They weren't just walking around the cabin, they were moving around the perimeter, circling us. A few minutes later, I heard something scrape against the side of the house. A dragging sound like fingernails on wood. That was too much. "Okay, that's it," I said. "I'm going out to check." "Are you crazy?" Sarah shot back. "We're fine, just relax." But I couldn't. My mind was racing. The others were still unconcerned, but I had to know what was out there. I grabbed a flashlight from the corner of the room and went out the back door, stepping onto the cold porch. The night air was thick and still. The rustling had stopped, and the woods were silent now, almost unnervingly so. I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees. My flashlight bounced off the trunks, casting long, crooked shadows in every direction. Then I saw something. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its shape somehow distorted, like the darkness itself had formed into a silhouette. I froze. My stomach dropped, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" No response. Just a slow, deliberate movement. It stepped closer out of the shadows. I could just make out its face now. It was pale, with deep, hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Its skin was stretched tight across its bones, almost like it had been pulled too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should have run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The thing took another step forward, and that's when I saw the shadow in the trees behind it. Another figure, and another, all moving toward me. I turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My friends were staring at me now, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sarah asked, standing up. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I saw something out there," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something in the woods." but they just laughed it off. "You've been drinking too much," Ben said, shaking his head. "I'm serious," I insisted. "There's something out there and it's not." But then I heard it again. The rustling. But this time it was closer. The sound of footsteps outside, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. I rushed to the window and peered out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, standing just beyond the trees, was one of the figures. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. "They're outside," I whispered. "They're watching us." One of the others, Ben, went to the door, opening it slightly to peer outside. "There's no one there," he said, frowning. But before I could say anything, the door slammed shut. The room plunged into silence. And then from outside came a low, guttural voice, whispering, "Come outside. We're waiting." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight to it, like it was coming from deep within the earth. I bolted upstairs, my hands shaking as I grabbed my bag and threw it over my shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." My friends stared at me, still skeptical, still unsure. But I could see the unease in their eyes now. They could hear it too. Something in the air had changed, something had shifted. The rustling outside had turned into something else now, a sound like scratching at the walls, the windows, as if they were trying to get in. We didn't wait. We grabbed our things, ran out of the cabin, and piled into the car, driving off without a second thought. We didn't speak for a long while, all of us too shaken to find the words. But as we drove down the narrow, winding road that led out of the woods, I glanced into the rearview mirror, and I saw them. Dozens of pale faces staring at us from the trees, watching. And I knew, even as the cabin grew smaller in the distance, that they weren't done with us. They would be waiting. It started with a knock on the door. I know it's a cliché. A knock on the door late at night is the setup for almost every horror story. But I swear this was different. At least I thought it was at the time. I'd just gotten home from work, the sky outside already darkening as the evening settled in. I wasn't expecting anyone. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. I dropped my keys onto the table and kicked off my shoes, ready to settle in with a cup of tea and a good book. Then there it was, a knock. Soft at first, like a tap on the door. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 9 p.m. Who would be knocking on my door at this hour? I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone, just the dark outline of the porch. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. My pulse quickened. I hesitated. Should I open the door? Maybe it was a neighbor who needed something, though none of my neighbors ever visited without calling first. I took a breath and unlocked the door. As I swung it open, I felt a sudden wave of unease wash over me. There, standing on my front step, was a man. He was tall, with a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His features were indistinct, shadowed under the brim, but his presence was overwhelming, like he belonged here in a way I couldn't understand. He was smiling, but not in a friendly way. His smile was wide, almost too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. The darkness around him seemed to pool, like the shadows were drawn to him, thickening the air. "Can I help you?" I asked, though my voice was shaky. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. His eyes, though I couldn't quite see them, felt like they were boring into me, watching me, calculating. "I'm lost," he said finally, his voice low and smooth, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. "Could you point me in the direction of the road? I'm not from around here." I swallowed. The man's clothes were too clean, too crisp for someone who was lost. And he didn't seem to be carrying anything, not even a bag or a jacket for the cool night air. "Sure, it's just a few miles down that way," I said, pointing down the street. I was trying to stay calm, trying not to let the dread bubbling up inside me show. There was no reason to feel afraid, right? He was just a lost traveler after all. But then the strange part came. The man didn't move. He didn't even glance in the direction I pointed. He just stood there grinning at me. "You're not scared, are you?" he asked, and his smile widened even more. The way his lips stretched made his face look almost wrong, like it wasn't meant to move that way. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea what to say. My mind was screaming at me to shut the door, to lock it, to get away from him, but my body refused to obey. "I'm not scared," I said, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded weak, uncertain. The man tilted his head slightly as if considering my words. "No, you're not," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "But you should be." That's when I felt it. The temperature dropped. The air went from warm to frigid in an instant. The streetlights outside flickered, casting strange shadows across the porch. I glanced down at my feet, and for a split second I thought I saw something move in the darkness, something crawling toward me from the edge of the yard. I stepped back, but the man followed, his smile never wavering. "You don't have to let me in," he said, his voice soft and almost coaxing. "I'm not asking for that. I'm just visiting. It's been a long time since I've been here." "Visiting?" I repeated, my throat dry. Who are you?" His smile faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. His face, the one I couldn't quite see, seemed to shift. It wasn't just the shadows playing tricks. His features stretched, distorted, like something was trying to force its way out. I recoiled, pressing my back against the door. "I'm someone you know," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "Someone you've always known." I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded, blood rushing in my ears. I glanced around, searching for anything that could help, any way out of this situation. But the world outside seemed to have faded into darkness, leaving just the porch, the man, and the suffocating silence. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man continued, taking another step closer. His hand reached up, but not to touch me. No, he was reaching for something behind me. I heard a soft scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across wood. "No." I slammed the door shut, locking it with a trembling hand. For a moment, everything was still. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Then there was a knock again. Not on the door, but on the window beside me. I jerked away, heart in my throat. The man was standing outside the window, grinning at me from the darkness, his face still distorted. And this time his smile wasn't just wide, it was impossible. His mouth stretched too far, too wide, like he was trying to pull it open. "You're not alone," he whispered, his voice muffled by the glass. "I'm still here, just outside." I backed away, my breath shallow. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but when I finally mustered the courage to look back, he was gone. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting, watching. He said he was someone I knew, someone I've always known, but I can't remember who. And every night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear his voice whispering from the shadows. "I'm still here." I was never one to believe in ghosts or hauntings. I've always been the logical type, the kind of person who dismisses strange noises in the night as the wind, or creaking floors as the house settling. But that all changed the day I found the mirror in the basement. It was one of those old full-length mirrors, the kind you might find in a thrift store or an antique shop. The frame was ornate, made of dark wood that had chipped and aged over the years. It was covered in dust when I first spotted it, shoved into the corner of the basement beneath a pile of boxes. I wasn't even sure why I went down there that day. I was just looking for a few old holiday decorations. But something drew me to it, a curiosity that I couldn't shake. The moment I pulled it from the corner and wiped the dust away, I felt it. A strange coldness in the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle over me. The mirror didn't reflect the room behind me like it should have. No, it reflected something else. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But when I stared at it longer, I realized that the reflection wasn't mine at all. It was a man, tall, thin, with dark hair and a face that was half shadowed. His eyes glinted with something I couldn't place, something almost alive. I backed away, heart racing, but the image in the mirror stayed exactly the same, frozen in place. I turned around, half expecting to find the man standing behind me, but the basement was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days passed without incident. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps the result of spending too much time in a dark, cluttered basement. But then, a week later, I found myself drawn back to the mirror. It was late at night when I went down, unable to shake the need to see it again. I didn't know why. I just felt compelled. When I reached the basement, the air was colder than usual, and the mirror was waiting for me, its surface gleaming under the weak light of the single bulb above. This time, I stood closer, almost as if I were testing it, trying to convince myself that what I saw before had been a hallucination. But no, there he was again. The man. His eyes were focused on me now, and his lips were moving. He was saying something, though I couldn't make out the words. I leaned closer to the mirror, my breath fogging up the surface as I tried to catch the words. Then I froze. The man's reflection wasn't just standing still anymore. He was moving. He was reaching out. His hand came up to the surface of the glass, pressing against it with an unnatural slowness. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped back quickly, knocking into a stack of old boxes, but the mirror didn't reflect my movements. The man's hand stayed pressed against the glass, his fingers trembling slightly. I could hear faint tapping like fingernails against the mirror. Without thinking, I grabbed the mirror, intending to turn it away from me. But the moment my hands touched it, the coldness deepened. It was as if the glass had become solid ice, freezing my fingers to its surface. I tried to pull my hands away, but they wouldn't move. The man's reflection didn't shift. He stayed there, watching me with that same knowing smile. And then the worst part. His reflection winked at me. I screamed, finally managing to wrench my hands free, stumbling backward, heart hammering in my chest. The mirror, for a moment, seemed to pulse, a strange shimmer running across its surface. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed the nearest object, a wrench, and threw it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me, but I couldn't stop shaking. For hours, I lay in bed, trying to convince myself that I had imagined everything. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the old glass had a defect, some optical illusion, some trick of the light. But deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning, I went down to clean up the broken glass. But when I reached the basement, the mirror was back in the corner, completely intact. The pieces I'd shattered were gone. The man's reflection stood there again, as if nothing had ever happened. This time I couldn't run. The man was staring at me through the glass, his expression colder, more deliberate. His eyes seemed to bore into mine, and I could feel my breath hitching in my chest. He was smiling again, but this time, it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of recognition. Without thinking, I rushed forward and yanked the mirror from its spot, carrying it outside. I didn't care where I took it, just as long as I got it away from my house. I dragged it down the street into the woods at the edge of town. There, I threw it into the river and watched as it sank beneath the dark water. I thought that was the end of it. But then, 2 days later, I found something strange in my mailbox. A photograph. It was a picture of me standing in my kitchen, staring into the mirror, my eyes wide in fear. The reflection of the man was standing right beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. The photo was dated today. I've locked all the mirrors in my house now, but I can still feel his eyes on me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see his reflection waiting. And I wonder, if I'd never thrown the mirror away, would I have seen the reflection of him standing beside me in my own house? Would he have found a way inside? Or is he already here? The house was supposed to be a fresh start. I had recently moved into a small, old home in the country to escape the chaos of city life. The quiet was a relief. The house itself was charming, if a little run-down, 2 stories, an overgrown garden, creaky wooden floors, and a large attic space that I had yet to explore. At first, everything seemed perfect. The first night I stayed there, the air was crisp, the stars were bright, and I spent hours just sitting by the window looking out over the dark fields. But that feeling of peace didn't last long. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old homes have a way of creaking and groaning at odd hours. But then, one night, I heard something that made me pause. A shuffling sound. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps coming from above. I froze, holding my breath. The attic. It was definitely coming from the attic. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal in the roof. But the sound didn't stop. It continued, dragging and scraping like something, or someone, was moving up there, pacing slowly back and forth. I hesitated for a moment before I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs to the attic. The door to the attic was old and heavy, the handle rusted, but it opened with a groan. Inside, the space was musty and dim, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. The only light came from the beam of my flashlight, cutting through the gloom. The room was empty. No raccoons. No animals. Just the clutter of an attic that had been left untouched for years. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, though. Something was off. Then I heard it again. A shuffle. Another step. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the corners of the room. It was coming from directly behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows and the piles of old belongings. I didn't stay long after that. I ran down the stairs, my mind racing with questions. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that house. The noises didn't stop. Every night, just after midnight, the dragging steps would return. I tried to ignore them, but the fear in my gut grew stronger each time. The worst part? It wasn't just the noises. It was the feeling that someone was watching me. Sometimes, when I would stand in the living room, I would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving in the periphery. I'd spin around, but nothing was there. It was as if someone was just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. One evening, unable to shake the unease any longer, I decided to investigate further. I grabbed my camera, thinking maybe I could catch something on film, something to explain what was happening. I wasn't expecting to see anything, of course. I just wanted some proof that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. I set up the camera in the attic, facing the corner where the sound seemed to come from most often. I left it running overnight and went to bed, convinced I wouldn't catch anything. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of dread hanging over me. I didn't want to look at the footage. I almost convinced myself that it wasn't worth it. But I had to know. I played the video. The first hour was uneventful, just the dust settling and the faint creak of the house. But then, about halfway through, something changed. The camera shifted slightly as if it had been nudged. And there, in the corner of the frame, I saw something move. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally as if it were too tall for the space. It moved closer to the camera inch by inch, and then I saw it, a face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera, into me. A face that didn't belong. I froze. My hand hovered over the pause button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. The figure didn't move, not immediately. It just stood there, staring for what felt like hours. Then, very slowly, it began to smile. Its lips stretched wide, impossibly wide, until the skin around its mouth cracked and tore. It was grinning at me. I yanked the camera out of the player and dropped it onto the floor. I couldn't breathe. The smile on that face was still burned into my mind. I ran upstairs, grabbed a crowbar from the garage, and smashed the attic door shut. I don't know what I thought that would do, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed a bag and left, telling myself that I just needed a break. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to shake off the fear, but it didn't work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, the grin. I returned to the house, determined to confront whatever was haunting me, to take control of the situation. But when I entered the attic and pried open the door, the space was different. It looked smaller, as if the walls had closed in around it. The old furniture and boxes were gone. The only thing left was a chair in the center of the room. And the mirror. It was there, standing in the middle of the room, the same mirror I had seen the night I moved in. But now, something was different about it. The surface was alive. The reflection was no longer just a mirror. It was moving. Inside the glass, I could see the figure standing there, still grinning. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. The man in the attic was waiting. I've always been a night owl, the kind of person who enjoys long drives when the world is asleep. So when I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway one evening, headed home from a late shift at work, I didn't think much of it. The road was empty, the sky a velvety black with only the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming cars. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude. It was around midnight when I noticed the car behind me. I hadn't seen it for long, just a blur of headlights in my rearview mirror. But it was strange. The car had been a good distance away when I first saw it, yet now it seemed to be tailing me. Not aggressively, just there, always in the mirror, always just behind me. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was just another driver, someone in a hurry, or perhaps just someone on the same lonely stretch of road. I kept my speed steady, trying to focus on the road ahead, the curve of the pavement, the occasional bump from the tires. But every time I glanced in the mirror, the car was still there. It hadn't pulled ahead, hadn't fallen back. I decided to speed up, just a little. Maybe I could shake them off. But the faster I went, the faster they went. It was like they were matching me, staying in sync with my movements, and it was starting to unnerve me. I glanced over at the dashboard, 12:40 a.m., and then back in the mirror. The headlights were still there, and now they were closer. Too close. I made a sharp turn off the highway at the next exit, hoping to throw them off, but when I looked back, the car was still there. It followed me off the exit ramp, its headlights casting long shadows across the empty road. My stomach twisted into a knot. Panic set in. What did this person want? I glanced down at my phone, but I was in the middle of nowhere with no service. The eerie silence of the night felt oppressive, like I was surrounded by a world that didn't want me to leave it. I made a few more turns, my heart pounding harder with each one. Each time I checked the rearview mirror, the car was closer. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was tracking me. Finally, I turned onto a long, deserted road with no streetlights. It was a dead end, the kind of road that led nowhere but a small wooded area. I told myself that I would stop, confront whoever it was, maybe ask if they needed help, maybe get their license plate number and report them to the police. I pulled to the side of the road and put the car in park. The headlights from the car behind me glared in my mirrors, almost blinding me, and then, just as I was about to open the door, the other car's lights turned off. I sat there in the dark, the sound of my breathing the only noise in the world. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd leave. Maybe they'd just turn around and drive off. I waited, listening. Then I saw it. The shadow of a person moving across the headlights of my car. Slowly, deliberately. I froze. Whoever it was, whatever it was, wasn't just walking by. They were circling the car. My skin prickled and my heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The shadow paused by my driver's side window. I could see the faint outline of a face. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his features obscured by the night, but his eyes, I could see his eyes. They were dark, hollow, empty. Then came the knock. A tap, light but insistent, on the window. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my pulse thundering in my ears. I stared at the figure, not daring to breathe, hoping he couldn't hear the frantic beating of my heart. The man didn't speak. He just stood there staring at me through the glass. His eyes seemed to drill into me like he was looking right through me. And then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the woods. I didn't understand. What did he want? Why was he pointing? I didn't want to find out. I hit the gas, spinning the wheel wildly, slamming the car back onto the main road. I glanced back. Nothing. No headlights, no figure, no sign of the car. I drove for what felt like hours, taking the longest route I could, weaving through town, making random turns just to make sure I wasn't being followed anymore. But no matter how much time passed, no matter how many roads I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I slammed the car in park and rushed inside. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat in the living room trying to calm my racing thoughts. But that night I couldn't sleep. The man's face, his hollow eyes, the way he pointed toward the woods, they wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing by the car, motionless. I woke up the next morning to an eerie silence. No knocking at the door, no phone calls. But something was different. Something was wrong. When I checked my phone, I saw it. A text message sent at 12:58 a.m., just 20 minutes after I had pulled over. It was a picture of my car, parked on the side of the road. And in the reflection of the window, there was a shadow of a man, standing just behind it, his face still a blur, but those eyes. I never saw the man again. But every now and then, when I drive alone at night, I'll glance in the rearview mirror and catch a glimpse of something. A figure standing just beyond the headlights, always watching, always waiting. I've stopped driving the highway, but I can't escape the feeling that he's out there, still waiting for me to take the same road again. And one day I will. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I had been living in the small cottage on the edge of town for a few months, and I had grown used to the solitude. The cottage was tucked away in a secluded area, surrounded by dense woods, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. I enjoyed the tranquility, the occasional sound of birds outside my window, the stillness of the forest as night fell. But that night was different. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the sky was clear, the air warm and calm. The next, dark clouds rolled in fast, blanketing the sky in thick, oppressive black. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in sheets. The trees outside swayed violently, their limbs creaking like old bones. I made a cup of tea and settled in by the fireplace, figuring I would ride out the storm in comfort. It was around 9:30 when I first heard the knock. It was light at first, just a soft, almost tentative tap on the door. I furrowed my brow. Who would be out in this kind of weather? No one in their right mind would be walking around in a storm like this. I waited, thinking it might be the wind or some animal scratching at the door, but then it came again. A knock. Slightly louder this time. I got up slowly and walked to the door, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. The last time someone visited was weeks ago, and the storm was only getting worse. I checked through the peephole. Nothing. I frowned and turned the handle cautiously, pulling the door open just a crack. The wind howled louder, sending a cold gust of air into the hallway, but there was no one on the porch. Nothing but the rain. The storm had only intensified since the knock, and I could barely make out the dark shapes of the trees in the yard through the torrential downpour. I stepped outside, peering into the dark. "Hello?" I called out into the storm. "Is someone there?" No response. I felt foolish standing in the rain, but I was also unnerved. It was as if the knock had never happened at all. I shook my head, muttering to myself. I was probably just hearing things, I told myself. The wind was playing tricks on me. I turned to go back inside, but as I stepped toward the door, I heard it again. The knock. Louder this time. Almost urgent. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, my breath shallow, but the porch was still empty. No sign of anyone. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My pulse raced. There was something wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the cottage felt thicker, heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I glanced at the clock, 9:45 p.m. I hadn't been standing outside for long, but the storm seemed even worse now, the wind howling like some wild creature outside. My skin prickled with unease. And then there was another knock. But this time it wasn't on the door. It came from above. I froze, looking up at the ceiling. There was an attic above me, a small, unfinished space I had only explored once, and it hadn't been used in years. But now I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, creaking across the floorboards above me. My stomach dropped. I had checked the attic when I moved in, and it had been empty. I remembered clearly that there was no one there, no strange noises. I didn't understand how anyone could be up there now. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam trembling in my hand as I ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. The storm outside seemed to drown out everything except the pounding of my heart in my ears. The attic door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill out. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking as I stepped inside. The attic was cold and dark, filled with boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, and forgotten junk. The smell of dust and old wood was thick in the air. There was no one there. I scanned the room with the flashlight, moving carefully between the boxes, the light bouncing off the walls. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy in the air. That's when I heard it again. A whisper. Soft, low, almost imperceptible. It came from the far corner of the attic, where a large trunk sat, covered in a thick layer of dust. The whisper was so faint I could barely make it out, but I could swear it was calling my name. Jessica. My breath caught in my throat. My name. But I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. I turned toward the corner, heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I felt like I was going to pass out from the fear. There was something there, something I couldn't see, something that was waiting for me to come closer. I stepped toward the trunk, my legs shaky, my hands clammy. And then, just as I reached out to touch the lid, the attic light flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. And then a figure appeared in the shadows. It was a man. Tall, thin, his face hidden by the darkness, but his eyes glowed faintly. He wasn't standing, not exactly. His body was half crouched, as if he was kneeling or crouching in the corner of the room. I froze. I didn't know if he was real. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt paralyzed. The figure began to move toward me, slowly, unnaturally, as if he was floating just inches above the floor. He was coming closer and closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I snapped out of my trance and bolted, my feet stumbling over the wooden floor, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I didn't dare look back as I raced down the stairs, the sounds of footsteps following me from above, gaining on me. I burst out of the house into the storm, not caring about the rain or the cold. I ran into the woods, not stopping until I could no longer hear the footsteps. When I finally caught my breath, I turned back toward the house. The cottage stood there, dark, silent. The storm had stopped, but the door was open. I live in a house that's older than I care to admit, a place that creaks and groans in the middle of the night like it's alive. It's been in my family for generations, inherited after my grandmother passed away, and though the house is charming, there's something unsettling about it. Something I've never been able to shake even after years of living there. It started one evening not long after I moved back in. I had spent most of the day unpacking boxes, settling back into my old room. The house was still in the same state it had always been, dusty, worn, a little tired, but familiar. After dinner, I decided to go for a walk around the house to clear my head. The house was built on a small hill, and from the windows, you could see the sprawling yard surrounded by trees, the dim light from street lamps stretching into the distance. But as I walked through the long hallway that stretched the length of the house, I felt someone watching me. The hallway was lined with portraits, old family photos of people I'd never met, their eyes always seeming to follow me as I moved. But that wasn't it. It wasn't just the feeling of being observed. It was something more. I felt a coldness, a presence that hovered just behind me, lurking in the shadows of the hallway. I turned to look over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I tried to shrug it off. The house was old, full of its little creaks and moans. The wind outside made the old windows rattle, and the floors were uneven from years of settling. I moved on, dismissing it as nothing. But the next night it happened again. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a sound, a faint shuffle like someone walking quietly down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one was supposed to be there, and I hadn't heard anyone else come in. I stood up and walked to the hallway, peering into the shadows. Nothing. The house was eerily silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creaking of the wooden floorboards. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. It was like something, or someone, was standing at the far end of the hallway watching me. The hallway light flickered. I forced myself to step forward. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved, but as I approached the end of the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it, a presence. I turned the corner into the dim light of the upstairs landing, the air heavy and cold. There was no one, but the weight of the silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just where the shadows grew deepest, there was a figure. A shadow standing perfectly still in the dark. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no body, just a silhouette of something human-shaped, but darker, more formless. I couldn't move. The figure didn't shift, didn't breathe. It just stood there, facing away from me as if it were waiting for something. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and I realized I was holding my breath. And then it turned. Slowly. Very slowly. Its head moved, a gradual rotation as if it were deliberately choosing to face me. The eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were empty voids. Black, cold, and lifeless. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure took a slow step forward, then another, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were curious. My heart pounded in my chest. I backed away instinctively, retreating toward the stairs, not daring to take my eyes off it. But as I reached for the banister, the lights flickered again and the figure vanished. There was no sound, no movement. It simply disappeared. I bolted downstairs, my legs shaky beneath me. I checked every room, every corner of the house, but there was no trace of anyone. Nothing but the familiar creaks and whispers of an old house settling in the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in the living room, the lights on, the curtains drawn tightly. The sense of being watched never left, and every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of those empty, hollow eyes on me. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been too tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The house was old, after all, and old houses had a way of playing with your senses. But that night, it happened again. The shuffling steps down the hallway, the flickering light, the weight of a presence in the shadows. And again I saw the figure standing at the far end of the hallway. This time I didn't wait for it to turn. I turned and ran. I didn't go back upstairs that night or the next. I spent the following days avoiding the hallway entirely, staying away from the second floor. But the feeling never left. It lingered like a dark cloud hanging just above me. Every time I walked into the hallway, I could feel it. Someone was waiting in the dark. I called a friend over one night, hoping that being with someone else would make the fear go away. But as we sat in the living room talking, the power suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the only light was from the moon filtering in through the windows. I heard it then, a low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It came from the hallway. I stood up and walked to the light switch, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I flicked it on and the lights came back to life. But when I turned to look down the hallway, the figure was there again, standing motionless at the far end. This time it was closer, much closer. The air was cold now, icy, and I could hear the faint whisper of someone breathing. It was no longer standing still. The figure was walking toward me, its footsteps slow, deliberate. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the police. By the time they arrived, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty, just as it had been every time before. But they didn't leave without checking. They searched the entire house, room by room, including the attic. The officer in charge looked at me strangely when he returned to the living room, a frown on his face. "There's no one here," he said, as if trying to reassure me. "But there's something strange. The hallway, the floorboards. It's like someone was walking on them, but there's no trace of anything unusual." I nodded, my heart sinking. I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't imagining it. As they left, I closed and locked the door behind them, and for the first time in weeks, I went to bed with the lights on. But the hallway still whispers to me at night. The creaking floorboards, the feeling of being watched, the figure. And every time I walk down that hallway, I feel its presence just behind me, always waiting. I've always been fond of the quiet. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and the nights were still enough to make you think the world had stopped moving. That's why, when I moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, I wasn't afraid of the isolation. I thought I'd enjoy it. The house was beautiful in a way that was almost eerie. Built in the late 1800s, it had tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling garden that had long since grown wild. It was exactly the kind of place I had been looking for, something with history, character, and space to think. But there was one thing I didn't expect: the window. It was in the living room, a massive bay window that looked out over the garden and the road that wound up to the house. I hadn't thought much of it when I first saw the house, but once I moved in and settled down, I couldn't help but notice it. No matter how much I cleaned, no matter how often I wiped down the glass, there was always something strange about the window. At night, when the light from the inside of the house spilled onto the glass, it would catch in a way that made the window look like a mirror. It was as if the house itself were looking back at me. I would often sit by the window at night, staring out at the empty road and the trees that grew thick around the house. I felt comforted by the isolation, the stillness of the world outside. But after a while, something started to bother me. I'd be sitting there, reading or watching TV, when I would catch a glimpse of something moving in the reflection of the window. I'd freeze. I'd tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or the movement of the trees outside. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I could swear I saw someone standing just behind me in the reflection. A tall figure, dressed in dark clothes, standing completely still. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the house. The only thing behind me was the empty room, the dim lights of the kitchen spilling into the living room. But the more it happened, the less I could dismiss it as my imagination. One evening, as I sat on the couch, the feeling came again, the one that prickled the back of my neck, the one that made me feel as if someone were standing right behind me. This time, I didn't even need to glance at the window to feel it. I could hear it, a soft, slow rustling like something brushing against the glass. I looked up. The figure was there. I froze. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my reflection. There was someone outside, standing just on the other side of the window, his face barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlights outside. I should have screamed, I should have called the police, but instead I just stared at him. His eyes, dark, unblinking, stared back at me. For a moment I thought I might pass out. My body felt frozen in place, unable to move. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me paralyzed on the couch and the man standing motionless in the window. Finally, I snapped out of it and jumped to my feet. I ran to the door, my heart pounding, but when I opened it, there was no one there. The porch was empty, the road dark and deserted. I checked every window, every corner of the house, but I didn't find anyone. It was like he had never been there. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept seeing those eyes, their emptiness, their coldness, whenever I closed my eyes. The next few days were uneventful. I went about my routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the window. Every time I passed the living room, I would glance over at the bay window, half expecting to see him there again. But it was always empty. Then, a week later, it happened again. I was sitting at the dining table eating dinner when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, the figure standing outside the window. This time I didn't wait. I didn't freeze. I stood up and ran to the door, flinging it open. But again, nothing. I stood outside, the chill of the night air biting at my skin, and stared into the empty road. The trees swayed in the breeze, the house stood silent. There was no one. I was starting to lose my grip on reality, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the house was messing with me. But the dread never went away. Every time I walked past the window, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me, always watching, always waiting. I started leaving the curtains drawn during the day, afraid that if I left them open, I would see him again. I avoided the living room entirely, retreating to the back rooms, but even there, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound again, the soft rustle like someone moving outside the window. My breath caught in my throat. I got up, my hands shaking, and cautiously walked to the living room. I didn't look at the window at first. Instead, I stood just inside the doorway, straining my ears, waiting to hear the movement again. And then I heard it, the faint tapping of fingers against glass. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bay window. He was there. But this time, he wasn't standing still. This time, the man was moving, his hand pressed against the glass, his face just inches from the window, his breath fogging up the glass. His eyes locked onto mine. The terror I felt was overwhelming. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. He lifted his hand and slowly dragged it down the window. I ran, my heart thundering, my legs carrying me out of the house and into the yard. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't stop the wave of panic that was suffocating me. I don't know how long I stood outside, but when I finally worked up the courage to go back inside, the window was empty. But the handprints, faint, smeared as if someone had pressed their palms to the glass, were still there. I never went near that window again. I moved out of the house the very next week, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way his eyes seemed to burn into me, like he was waiting for something, or for me to make the first move. And now, whenever I pass a house with a bay window, I can't help but glance inside, half expecting to see him staring back at me. The house I moved into wasn't anything special at first glance. It was an old two-story building in a quiet, sleepy neighborhood, the kind of place you don't think twice about when passing by. The kind of house that feels as if it's been there for ages, holding stories in the creaks of its floorboards and the dust in its corners. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a fresh start. The house was affordable, the location secluded enough to give me space, and it had an air of charm, albeit a little run down. The wooden floors were scratched and faded, the walls a dull shade of yellow, but it had potential. I didn't mind the isolation. It was peaceful, too peaceful at times, though, like there was something buried beneath the silence. I remember how the air seemed unnaturally still, as if even the house itself was holding its breath. Things started to feel strange not long after I moved in. At first, it was subtle. A door that would creak open when no one was around, a light that flickered for no reason. Little noises at night that couldn't be explained. Footsteps above me when I knew no one was up there, soft whispers just outside my door when I was certain I was alone. But the thing that really unsettled me, the thing that changed everything, was the room beneath the floor. It was in the basement, a space that I hadn't explored yet. The stairs down were narrow and steep, the air musty, but I figured it would be useful for storage. The door to the basement had an old brass knob that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. When I opened it, I was greeted with the smell of mildew and old wood. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the walls. The basement was exactly what I expected. A large, unfinished space full of clutter, boxes, old furniture, and junk that looked like it had been left behind by previous owners. I walked around, pushing past stacks of boxes, when I noticed something odd near the back wall. A trapdoor. It was small, rectangular, covered by a layer of dust, with rusted hinges and an iron handle. I knelt down to inspect it, curious. The wood around the edges was warped, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I pulled on the handle and it creaked open with a jolt. Below, there was a small, narrow set of wooden stairs, barely wide enough for my shoulders. It was dark and I couldn't see anything beyond the first step. I stood there for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something about it didn't sit right. The room felt different, like it was holding something it didn't want me to find. But I was too curious, too eager to uncover whatever was hidden. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and descended the stairs. The air down there was thick and stale, the musty smell overpowering. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in. But there was something strange about it. The walls were lined with old, yellowed newspapers, as if someone had covered them in a hasty attempt to hide something. There was nothing else in the room but a wooden chest in the far corner. I approached the chest cautiously, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The wood was cracked and weathered, but it was still sturdy. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the lid. Inside there was nothing but dust. But as I peered in, I noticed something unusual, a faint, scratched pattern on the bottom of the chest. It looked like a series of symbols or markings, something that had been carved into the wood long ago. I leaned in closer, my flashlight casting a dim light over the carvings. And then I heard it. A soft, scraping noise coming from the walls. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the flashlight away from the chest and turned toward the source of the sound. It was a low, scraping noise, like something was being dragged across the floor behind the walls. I stood frozen, listening intently. It stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I decided I'd had enough. I slammed the chest shut, scrambled up the stairs, and bolted the trapdoor behind me. The noise in the walls, the strange feeling in the room, it all left me shaken. I didn't go back down there for days. I tried to dismiss it all as nothing, just the house settling, old pipes making strange noises. But the sense of unease lingered, gnawing at me every time I walked past the basement door. Then one evening, I decided I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I had to know what was down there. I had to understand the strange feeling, the scratching sound that haunted the back of my mind. That night, after a long day of work, I grabbed the flashlight again and descended into the basement, heart pounding in my chest. But when I opened the trapdoor, something was different. There was light coming from below. Not from the bare bulb overhead, but from the room beneath the floor. A faint, eerie glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness. The scraping noise had stopped. Everything was still. I descended the stairs cautiously, my breath shallow. The room looked exactly the same as before, but something had changed. The walls were no longer covered with newspapers. They were bare now, revealing rough, unfinished wood. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. The chest was gone. In its place was a large, wooden figure standing in the center of the room. It was tall, hunched over, its arms elongated, its face hollow and grotesque. It looked like a puppet, but it was made of wood, old, cracked, and weathered like something that had been forgotten for centuries. I took a step closer, my heart thumping violently in my chest. The figure's eyes were black holes, staring at me, unblinking. Seemed to be watching me, waiting. Then the light flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, I heard it. A whisper, faint but clear. "Don't look away." I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. The flashlight fell from my hand, its beam casting a jagged light across the figure. But the room wasn't empty anymore. From the shadows, something moved. More figures, wooden and twisted, started to emerge from the corners of the room, their limbs jerking unnaturally as if they were coming to life. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, crashing through the basement door, up the stairs and out of the house into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street. The house is still there, empty now. No one has moved in since I left, and I'm not sure I ever want to go back. But sometimes in the stillness of the night, I hear it, the faint scraping sound. It's coming from beneath the floor, and I know they're still there. It was a rainy night when I first heard the voice on the other end of the phone. I was home alone in my apartment, curled up with a book, the sound of the rain tapping against the window providing a soothing backdrop to the otherwise silent room. I had just gotten comfortable when the phone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be a wrong number or perhaps someone from work. "Hello?" I said, a little groggy from the quiet of the evening. There was no answer, just a long, heavy pause. At first, I thought the line had gone dead. But then, from the other side, I heard a soft whisper. "Hello?" It was my own voice. I froze. My blood ran cold. I could hear the exact same words I had just said to the phone, but distorted, faint, like an echo from a distance. "Hello?" I repeated, trying to shake off the dread creeping up my spine. "Who is this?" There was another silence, but this time I could hear something else on the other end. A soft rustling like cloth brushing against fabric. Then the voice came again, this time deeper, almost guttural. "Are you home?" I felt a chill spread through my body. Who was this? A prank caller? The words felt too deliberate, too pointed. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling now. The line went quiet. I waited, holding my breath, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. Then, with sudden clarity, the voice responded. But it wasn't the same voice anymore. It wasn't human. "I'm in your house." The words sent a jolt of panic through me. I bolted upright from the couch, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? How could they know I was home? My mind flashed through the possibilities. Was it someone outside watching me through the window? No, the blinds were closed. I checked. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, the line clicked again, and the voice came through once more, this time louder and clearer. "I'm in your house," it repeated, but now it sounded different, closer, as if whoever was speaking was in the same room with me. I rushed to my front door and locked it, my hands shaking. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I listened, straining to hear any sounds from inside the apartment. Nothing. I turned on the lights, checking every room, peering around corners, under furniture, behind the curtains. But there was no one there. The apartment was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy presence that seemed to follow me as I moved through the place. I returned to the phone, almost afraid to pick it up again, but I had to know. I pressed the receiver to my ear. "Hello?" I said again, trying to sound confident, but it came out as a whisper. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the line. But then a sound. The softest of footsteps, barely audible, just behind me. I turned around, my stomach dropping. But when I looked, the room was empty, just the faint glow of the lamp casting shadows across the walls. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I glanced toward the hallway, then to the kitchen, then back to the living room. No one. My eyes darted back to the phone. "Are you alone?" The voice came again, closer now, almost whispering in my ear. I spun around, but there was still no one there. I grabbed the phone, ready to end the call, but it was as if my hand was frozen in place. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice spoke again. "I'm right behind you." I turned around, my heart in my throat, and there, in the dim light, I saw a shadow, a dark, formless figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the reflection of the window. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall, unnaturally still, like a silhouette in the darkness. I screamed and dropped the phone, stumbling backward. My breath caught in my chest. My hands were clammy with sweat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow didn't move either. It just stood there watching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Gone as if it was never there. I grabbed the phone off the floor, desperate to end the call, but as I picked it up, the line went dead. The eerie silence in the apartment was deafening. I immediately called the police. I explained what had happened, but they were skeptical. They promised to send someone to check it out, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no strange noises. Everything was as it should be. They suggested it might have been a prank or some kind of technical issue with the phone line. But I knew what I had heard. That night I stayed awake, too scared to sleep. I locked every door, checked every window, and kept the lights on. But the quiet was oppressive. The sense of being watched never left me. Then around 3 a.m. the phone rang again. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. My hand was trembling. I listened, but there was only silence on the other end. I spoke into the receiver, trying to sound firm. "Who is this?" And then, just like before, I heard my own voice. "I'm in your house." I slammed the phone down and bolted from the room, the dread crawling over my skin. This time I didn't check the rooms. I didn't check the windows. I just ran. I left the apartment and never went back. The phone was still ringing when I walked out the door. I had always been the type of person who loved the quiet, the solitude. Maybe that's why I decided to take a weekend trip to the mountains, far from the distractions of the city, into the thick of nature. A few days away in an isolated cabin seemed like the perfect way to unwind. The cabin was remote, nestled deep within the forest, accessible only by a winding dirt road. It was exactly what I needed, peaceful, undisturbed, with no neighbors for miles. The cabin's owner had left a key under the mat, and there was a note in the kitchen, telling me to make myself at home. I unpacked my things and settled in. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trees. The weather had been fine when I arrived, but as dusk approached, the clouds grew darker. A storm seemed imminent, but I didn't mind. I was already beginning to enjoy the isolation. I went for a walk after dinner. The air was crisp, and the wind had started to pick up, rustling the branches of the trees around me. The path leading from the cabin wound deeper into the forest, a dirt trail that seemed to stretch endlessly. The only sound was the occasional crack of twigs beneath my boots and the howling wind. I didn't know how far I walked, maybe a mile, maybe two, but eventually the trail began to change. It started to curve and twist in strange directions, as if the forest itself was reshaping the path, leading me deeper into the unknown. I felt a sense of unease creeping in. Something about the way the trees loomed overhead, blocking out much of the fading light, made the atmosphere feel oppressive, suffocating. That's when I first noticed something unusual. The trail seemed to loop back on itself. I came around a bend, expecting to see the cabin in the distance, but instead I found myself at the same place I had started. The same patch of ground, the same broken branch sticking up from the ground. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. I retraced my steps, trying to find a different route, but when I came around the next bend, I found myself standing in the same spot again. The same broken branch. The same patch of ground. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. The path had become a maze, twisting in circles, each turn leading me back to where I had been. My heart began to race. I tried to turn back, but no matter which direction I walked, I always ended up in the same spot. The trees closed in around me, blocking my view of the sky, making it impossible to see any landmarks. Panic started to set in. I was lost. I had been lost the moment I stepped onto this cursed path. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, not even a faint bar. The wind howled through the trees, drowning out any other sounds. I was alone. completely alone. I kept walking, hoping for some sign of escape, but the path only seemed to grow longer, more distorted. The more I walked, the more it felt like the forest itself was changing, rearranging the landscape to keep me trapped. The sun had set by now, and the darkness pressed in around me. I couldn't see anything clearly, only shadows and fleeting glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. I could feel something following me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. No one. But then I heard a sound. Footsteps. I froze. There was no way anyone could be out here with me. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the cabin. The footsteps came closer. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was walking behind me. I whipped around, but there was still no one there. My breath was ragged now, my mind spiraling into a frenzy. I started running. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from the footsteps. They were getting closer, always just behind me, as if someone was chasing me through the trees. I ran and ran until my legs ached, until I could barely breathe. But when I slowed to catch my breath, I found myself standing in the same spot again. The same broken branch. The same patch of ground. I collapsed to my knees, panic threatening to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the air in the forest felt thick, like the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a whisper, not from behind me but from ahead. Keep going. It was a voice, soft and distant, but it was unmistakable. A man's voice. The voice was calm, soothing, as though trying to coax me forward. But there was something wrong with it. It didn't sound human. It was too flat, too hollow. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and took a few steps toward the voice. I didn't know why. Something compelled me, like an unseen force guiding me down the path, pulling me forward. The trees opened up ahead, and I stepped into a clearing. The moon was rising above the horizon, casting an eerie light over the scene. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a person standing motionless in the center of the clearing. But as I approached, I realized that it wasn't a person at all. It was a shadow, a shape that seemed to twist and writhe in the moonlight, its outline constantly shifting. It looked like it was made of smoke, but there was something solid about it too, something that felt wrong. The figure turned toward me, and I could see its face, if you could even call it a face. It was an empty void, hollow where the eyes should have been, the mouth a jagged line of darkness. It stared at me with a kind of cold, unfathomable intensity. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Then the whispering started again, louder this time, as though it was coming from all directions. Stay with me. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And before I could do anything, the ground beneath my feet gave way. The path, the trees, the figure, all of it seemed to collapse into darkness. I fell, and for a brief moment I felt weightless, like I was floating through an endless void. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the cabin. The storm was gone. The rain had stopped. It was as if no time had passed at all. I stumbled inside, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I never left the cabin again. I couldn't. Every time I stepped outside, the path would appear before me, just beyond the tree line, stretching out into the dark forest. It was calling me. The figure in the clearing was calling me. I left the next morning, abandoning the cabin and the forest behind me. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I hear the whisper, "Keep going." I've always been one to enjoy my solitude. A solitary weekend in a small cabin by a lake seemed like the perfect escape. No phone signal, no distractions, just peace and quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. The cabin was small, rustic, with a wood-burning stove and a big bay window overlooking the lake. The weather had been kind when I arrived, sunny and warm, but the forecast predicted a storm that would arrive the next day. It was the kind of storm that rolled in heavy and fast, the kind that could change the entire atmosphere of the place in the blink of an eye. I didn't mind. The storm would be the perfect excuse to curl up by the fire with a good book and watch the rain dance on the lake. But as night fell, a strange unease settled over me. It wasn't the storm that unsettled me, it was the silence. The air felt thick, heavy, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. It was nothing. But when I glanced out of the large bay window, I couldn't help but notice a flicker of movement out on the dock. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a deer moving through the woods behind the cabin. But no, this was different. Someone, or something, was standing on the dock staring at the cabin. I squinted, trying to make out the figure, but the fading light and the thickening storm made it hard to see clearly. Still, I could tell it was tall, unmoving, and unnervingly still. I held my breath. It could have been a person. But then again, it could have been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. I took a deep breath and turned away from the window. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "Just the storm messing with your head." But the feeling of being watched only intensified. I decided to go to bed early. I didn't need to worry about whatever was on the dock, if it was even real. But as I lay there in the dark, the silence around me grew more suffocating. The house was old, creaky, and every little sound echoed through the rooms. At one point, I swore I heard something moving outside my window, faint footsteps across the gravel path. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. The trees swaying, branches knocking against the cabin, all of that. But the longer I lay there, the more the sensation grew. Someone was outside. The storm began just as the weather report predicted. The wind howled, the rain pounded against the windows, and the night grew darker and colder. I stayed in bed, keeping my eyes closed, listening to the storm outside. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The tapping came again, steady and rhythmic, as if someone was gently tapping their knuckles against the glass. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I got out of bed and walked to the window. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw someone standing behind me. It wasn't my reflection. It was the figure I had seen earlier, the one on the dock. Tall, motionless, just staring at me through the window. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. But when I looked, no one was there. I stared at the empty room, the door still shut, the wall still intact. Nothing. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Was I just imagining things? I could still feel the presence in the room, the sensation that someone was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I decided to leave the room to get some fresh air and clear my head. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped into the hallway, and opened the front door. The storm had intensified, the wind whipping the trees and sending sheets of rain in every direction. I couldn't see much past the porch, but something about the night felt different, wrong. I stepped outside, hoping to break the oppressive feeling that had settled over me. The air was damp and cold, and the ground was slippery with rain. I walked around the cabin, scanning the surroundings with the beam of my flashlight. There was nothing. No figure on the dock. No sign of movement. Just the storm, the howling wind, and the endless sound of rain hitting the earth. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. The storm had almost a calming effect once I was outside. But just as I turned to head back inside, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the bay window of the cabin. I whipped around, flashlight aimed at the window, my pulse quickening again. Through the rain-smeared glass, I saw a figure standing in the room. The same figure that had been outside, staring at me earlier. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still, staring directly at the window as if it knew I was watching. As if it was waiting for me to look away. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. My mind was reeling. What was going on? Why was that figure inside now? I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the reception, leaving me in complete isolation. I turned on every light in the cabin, trying to fill the space with warmth, with normalcy. But the shadows grew longer as the storm raged outside, and the house creaked with every gust of wind. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unease. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see that figure standing there, but it was always just out of view, hiding in the darkness. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, the flashlight in my hand, the wind howling outside. I couldn't leave. I couldn't stay. The presence in the cabin, the figure in the reflection, it was driving me to the edge. When the storm finally stopped, the sky lightened just enough for me to see. The figure was gone, but there was something else in the bay window. A handprint, pressed against the glass, its fingers wide and long, leaving an impression in the condensation. I didn't stay another minute. I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and left, the sunlight just beginning to break through the clouds. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me leave. I was never one to take the bus. Public transportation always felt like a hassle, crowded, noisy, and uncomfortable. But when I missed the last train home from a late meeting, I had no choice. The bus stop was just a few blocks away from the station, and it seemed like the only option. It was already late, close to midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet. A light drizzle had started to fall, and I pulled my coat tighter around me as I walked to the bus stop. The rain made everything feel a bit unreal, blurring the lights of the city and casting long, distorted reflections on the pavement. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The bus schedule said it should be here any minute, but I hadn't seen a single soul walking by, let alone another passenger. Just the low hum of distant traffic, the occasional flicker of a street light, and the soft sound of rain. When the bus finally arrived, it seemed almost too quiet, like it had appeared out of nowhere. I stepped up to the door, which opened with a quiet hiss. The driver was a man I'd never seen before, middle-aged with a graying beard and dark, tired eyes. He didn't speak a word, just nodded slightly as I stepped onto the bus. I took a seat near the back, away from the handful of other passengers. The bus was mostly empty, save for a few scattered people who all seemed to be lost in their own worlds. I glanced out the window, watching the city fade into the distance, the dimly lit streets stretching into the darkness. The ride was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The rain had picked up, now beating against the windows with a constant, rhythmic tap. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but the battery was nearly dead, and the screen was too dim to make out anything clearly. A few stops passed, but no one else boarded. It felt like the bus was moving farther and farther away from the city, as though it were leaving the real world behind and entering something different. When the bus made another stop, I glanced up and noticed that one of the passengers had gotten off. A tall woman, wearing a raincoat and carrying an umbrella, had stood up without a sound and exited the bus. She hadn't said a word to anyone, not even to the driver. It wasn't unusual, but something about her left a chill in my spine. She hadn't made a single noise as she moved, no creak of the seat, no rustling of her coat. She just stood up and walked off, like she was already a part of the night. I looked out the window again, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The streets were dark, the buildings seemed abandoned, and there was no sign of life beyond the occasional flash of headlights in the distance. And then the bus began to slow. I didn't recognize the stop we were approaching. In fact, I didn't recognize anything around me. The streets had changed. The buildings were different, the lights flickered in strange patterns, like they were on the verge of going out completely. The sky above was now a deep, unnatural black, and the rain had stopped entirely. The bus stopped in front of a lone streetlight, its weak glow barely cutting through the darkness. I glanced around. There were no signs, no familiar landmarks, just this empty, desolate street. The feeling of unease grew, and I could feel my heart begin to race. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his tired eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before he turned back to the road. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. He just kept driving. I was about to ask again when I noticed something strange. The other passengers, who had been silent up until now, were all staring at me. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but their eyes were fixed on me, cold and unblinking. It was as if they had all been waiting for something, waiting for me. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and the bus jolted, the engine sputtering. The low hum of the bus seemed to die out for a moment before it started up again, but now it felt off, too smooth, like the wheels were no longer on real pavement. The air grew thicker, colder, as if the world outside had disappeared entirely. I looked out the window again, and now the darkness outside seemed to stretch infinitely. No city, no road, no sign of life, just endless blackness swallowing everything. Then I heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible above the hum of the engine. "Get off." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't the driver's, nor was it from any of the passengers. It was coming from behind me, soft, insistent, but somehow not entirely human. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Just empty seats, the low flicker of dim lights overhead. "Get off," the voice whispered again, closer this time, and I felt a sharp chill crawl down my spine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of my seat. The driver's eyes met mine again in the rearview mirror. He didn't speak, but there was a slight shift in his expression, an almost imperceptible nod. "Next stop," he muttered, his voice low and raspy, as if the words were forced from his throat. I stood up instinctively, my body moving before I could process what was happening. The bus was slowing down again. But this time I didn't want to get off. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The bus stopped in front of an alleyway. The streetlight above flickered once more, casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. The darkness at the end of the alley was absolute. Before I could react, the doors to the bus hissed open. I didn't want to get off. I didn't want to go anywhere near that alley, but something inside me compelled me to move. The air around me felt thick, pressing against my chest, and the whisper grew louder in my head. "Get off." I stepped off the bus. My feet were heavy, reluctant, but they carried me forward, drawn toward the alley. The doors shut behind me with a soft thud, and then the bus was gone. I turned around, and the street was completely empty. No bus, no lights, no sound. I was standing alone in a narrow, empty alley, the air cold and still. I pulled out my phone. No signal. A heavy silence settled over me, broken only by my shallow breathing. I glanced over my shoulder, but the alley stretched out endlessly in front of me, no escape in sight. I tried to step back toward where the bus had been, but the alley seemed to elongate, its shadows stretching toward me like tendrils. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was behind me, moving closer. And this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a low growl vibrating through the very air around me. I never believed in ghosts, but that was before I found myself in a small, rundown motel at the edge of town. It wasn't much. A dusty room with a single bed, an old TV that barely worked, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was late, and I had no choice but to stop. The storm outside had come out of nowhere, torrential rain flooding the roads, and the nearest town was still miles away. The motel was one of those places that seemed stuck in time, old-fashioned neon signs that buzzed faintly outside, flickering occasionally as if they were about to die out. The clerk who checked me in was an older man with hollow eyes and a voice that seemed too tired for his age. I didn't think much of it at the time. He handed me the key and directed me to the far end of the parking lot, where my room was located. When I got to the room, I noticed something strange. The window across from the bed, while small, was cracked open just a bit. I didn't recall opening it, but in my haste to get inside and out of the storm, I thought nothing of it. I closed the window, locked it, and pulled the curtains shut. The storm outside was relentless. The sound of rain hitting the roof was deafening, and the wind howled like a beast in the night. I took a quick shower, then lay down on the bed, flicking through channels on the ancient television set. But nothing could hold my attention. My mind kept drifting back to the oddness of the place. How quiet it was, how still. It felt like something was off, though I couldn't quite place it. I turned the TV off, hoping to sleep, but then I heard it. A sound coming from outside the room. A scraping noise, faint but persistent, like something, or someone, was dragging its feet along the concrete. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the covers tighter around me, listening. The noise stopped, but the feeling of unease lingered. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. 2:13 a.m. It was then I saw something through the thin gap between the curtains, the reflection of a figure standing outside my window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some reflection of the storm or the street lamp outside. But the figure in the glass was unmistakable. It was tall, wearing dark clothing, and standing completely still just outside my window. It was a person, but something about the stillness of the figure made my skin crawl. It wasn't just that they were standing there, it was the way they weren't moving. No fidgeting, no shifting weight, no attempt to get out of the rain. Just staring. I froze, unable to move, my eyes locked on the reflection. I felt my breath quicken, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to call the front desk. I wanted to call the police. But I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't even know why. My legs felt heavy, like they were cemented to the floor. I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of it, to will my brain into rational thought. Suddenly the figure moved. Not in a sudden, jerky motion, but slow, methodical. They turned ever so slightly and began walking away from the window toward the edge of the parking lot. I exhaled, finally able to move. I got up from the bed, my legs shaky beneath me, and moved toward the window. But when I pulled the curtain back, there was nothing out there. Just the rain. The empty parking lot. The figure was gone. I felt a rush of relief mixed with confusion. Maybe it had been a hallucination. A trick of the light, maybe even the storm playing with my mind. I stepped back from the window and went to the door, checking the lock to reassure myself that no one could get in. I tried to lie down again, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept imagining that figure, wondering if I had truly seen someone out there or if I had conjured it up in my tired, anxious state. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Then, just as I was about to drift off, the scraping sound returned, closer now, right outside my door. I leapt out of bed and pressed my ear to the door. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was testing the door. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, but I didn't know where to go, and I couldn't just leave in the middle of the storm. The only thing I could do was wait. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I waited, barely daring to breathe, listening for anything, any noise, any movement. But there was nothing. The world outside the door was quiet, empty. I checked the door again. Still locked. Still no sound. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I backed away from the door, my legs trembling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore. I just wanted to leave, but I couldn't. The storm was still raging outside. The next morning, I woke up to find the sky had cleared, the storm gone as quickly as it had come. But the events of the night before lingered in my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I packed my things and headed to the front desk to check out. The clerk was there again, the same tired man, but this time he looked at me with a strange sort of recognition in his eyes. "Room 206? He asked quietly as I handed over my key. I nodded, suddenly feeling a cold pit form in my stomach. He didn't say anything for a moment, but then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You're the second person to stay there this week." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke in a low voice, barely audible. "There's something strange about that room. People always see someone out the window, standing there, watching." I froze. "The last person who stayed there," he continued, "they didn't leave. They disappeared." I stared at him, my blood running cold. The room, the scraping sounds, the figure in the window, it wasn't my imagination. It was real. And whatever, or whoever, it was still out there waiting. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.